underscore 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 underscore. Stoic glared at the dragons who had him in an unbreakable grasp. They held his arms wide apart and were strong enough to stop him struggling, and the others that surrounded him made up the rest of the threat. The four-winged dragon who had taken his wife and child had returned for him, with a strange vigilante riding on its back. "Where are ye taking me?" he demanded, struggling with all his remaining strength. Then the accomplice, a strange man riding on an accursed night fury, hissed at him from behind a mask. But the truly scary thing was that the dragon also growled at the same time, as if the other being was simply another muscle the other could use in time with his own reactions. There was no response from the obvious leader in a crown of dragon horns to Stoic's yelling. Stoic thought back it must have only been half an hour to a normal day on a ship. Underscore 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 underscore. They had been sailing to meet Drago Bloodfist and negotiate a treaty that would rid Berk of dragons. His people and himself were growing desperate. If he could offer weapons, men, ships, even host him and his people on his island in return for peace from the dragon surge, then he would happily hand it over. If they could not drive them away, then they would starve. Stoic had stood on the ship and had spoken with his men as the night drew in, telling him his plans and asking for their approval, as he would not upset his own people, even if it was for their own good. They had agreed, but as they did so they heard a thump from the other end of the ship. When they looked they had found nothing, but now Stoic would bet his good right arm that it was one of these dragon people listening on him. Most likely the one riding the night fury. He could blend into the night as easily as his mount. The next early dawning morning he heard the chilling night fury scream, and rushed out to fight, only to be plucked off the ship by two dragons, their species unknown. His bellows of fury were met with passiveness from the dragons. He was carried a good height out of catapult range. His men's attempts to save him were useless. He was hovering above the clouds when a dark shadow whistled across the sky. He tried to track it, but it was too fast. Finally it stopped before him. The night fury hovered before him, its rider sitting on its bare back, with the rider's hands only resting on its neck. The rider was dressed in black leather with small red symbols on his shoulder pads and on the back of his gloves, which had dragon claws on them. They looked hollowed out and slipped over the first two joints of his hands to give his fingers strength and mobility. His black outfit was simple in color but held many buckles and stitches, hinting at a superior design. Stoic couldn't see his face, as a mask similar to the Night Fury's face was hiding him, acting like a helmet with some of his short auburn brown hair exposed at his nape. Through the slits he saw green eyes like the dragon. On his arm was a dagger handle, concealed in a slot along his arm. On his legs were several other metal things that looked like weapons. Stoic didn't care what they were. Finally there were 4 small hoops hanging from his legs, 2 on each calf, their purpose as hidden as the dagger. The Night Fury was sleek, streamlined, and medium-sized compared to other dragons. It had a cat-like grace in its muscles with eyes as green as poison. The wings and wing flaps shimmered slightly with shiny scales. The eyes were fixed on him with an intelligence above a dumb beast, and Stoic felt that this dragon was judging him. The way it hovered and flew to circle him demonstrated how perfect it was for flying. The wings hardly beat in the warm-up drafts of the oncoming day, and the slightest tilts changed direction. All its wing flaps moved in sync, as did his rider. Even with only smooth scales to hold on to, the young man didn't fear practically hanging onto a dragon tilting at a 90-degree angle to Earth. Stoic glared when the man and dragon hovered before him. The rider stood up on the Night Fury's back. His balance and awareness of the wind was impressive, as was his trust in the beast's ability to not simply roll him off. They moved as one. The beast came closer, and Stoic prepared to kick and fight. The young man was right in his face. He could hear him breathing inside his mask. The head tilted to the side and he inhaled deeply. Was he smelling him? Then his sharp eyes darted to the axe at his hip and promptly snatched it off him. Stoic kicked. The young man caught his leg and moved with it, throwing himself back into the abyss of clouds. Stoic grinned in brief victory. But the grin turned into a jaw drop when the dragon twisted unnaturally fast in midair to follow the human to catch him. The man flew through the clouds and into them, so Stoic lost sight. The Night Furies vanished a split second later. Its streamlined body cut through the clouds like a hot knife through butter. Then, out of the sea of cloud, the young man rose again, standing on his dragon once more. Beside him was another figure, standing tall with a mystical staff. He wore a helmet mask also, with a crown of dragon horns with stripes of blue along them and the entire mask. There were only slits for eyes too, no mouth, with the eyes spared of blue to draw attention. They held a shield painted blue, yellow and red in a pattern that reminded Stoic of fire. The armor this person wore looked light and made for speed, not for heavy blows, since it appeared to be made out of hardened and clay-infused wraps of fabric. Like a shell. The staff was curled at one end and knobbed at the other, with another curve. This person had a cape which blew out behind them dramatically, the ends tattered like a phantom. The entire look was dragonish, yet also haunting with those large, sightless eyes. Then the dragon they were standing on rose above the clouds. It was the four-winged creature with large horns and a wide toothy grin that had stolen his family years ago. It was large, at least 3 times larger than the Night Fury, and could hold the demonic human on its neck effortless. The second pair of wings made its hovering practically stillness. Its scales were colored from salmon to peach to white for its underbelly, and its eyes were golden and the pupils narrow. He glared at it come to finish the job. The young man and the Night Fury flew up into the air over to Stoic. The man made subtle twists in his body, turning to balance without moving at all. He had no fear of falling. He once again approached Stoic and pulled out a sword that promptly set itself on fire. Stoic gasped at it. The man put it close to his face in warning, saying silently not to repeat his last stunt. Then he proceeded to systematically remove all his hidden weapons and tossed them to the terrible terror pack that had followed the four-winged dragon. Other dragon species were thunderdrums, nadders, zipliback, and 2 or 3 he had no knowledge of. Once weaponless, both dragon and demon in human shape backed off and flew next to the taller person. The young man sat back down on his mount, legs either side of his head, and before the wings. The taller person rattled the staff and pointed in a given direction with certainty. The dragons all flew northeast at his command. They had been flying that way ever since. Underscore 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 underscore. Now the sun was high in the sky, showing it was mid-morning. Stoic growled. After being dangled for an hour he decided that he hated flying. "What do ye want with me?" he demanded. Neither responded. At least the leader stood upright. That was human behavior, and he wasn't interested in killing him right off the bat. Vikings could be stubborn, and he would use all his stubbornness to find a way out of this mess. He may have better luck taking out the smaller one when he was on the ground. The air was his realm, but he didn't look very strong. As if sensing his thoughts about him, the young man's head sharply turned to him and he let out a shriek that sounded scarily like the signature scream of the dragon he was riding. Stoic flinched. The other man riding the four-winged demon sharply raised a hand at the young man in a message for obedience, a strange bark sounding too, before being followed with a low growl as the hand lowered ominously. The demon and the devil seemed to converse, for a moment, one giving low-sounding trills and groans, and the other odd low chirps and mock growls. They finally shut up and the human demon one let out a growl that started high and went lower, expressing reluctance but obedience. It reminded Stoic of the moody groans of a teenager, but far more hackle-raising. Then both returned to focusing on their flying with the small flock of dragons all around them, making Stoic paranoid for his life. Finally they approached a mountain-sized fortress of ice, the nest. Stoic realized. The dragons all filed effortless through some rocky crevasses. He lost sight of the human demons for a split second and the 2 dragons holding him tossed him onto a flat of rock. Stoic landed as gracefully as a Viking could and turned with a fierce stance to defend himself, weaponless as he may be. All around the dim room the dragons lined the walls, and some crept onto the floors and surrounded him with growls and demon eyes. The Night Fury entered with its rider next, the man dismounting into a crouch below the extended wing, like a protective shield. The man, even in the dim light, tilted his head at Stoic the Vast, as if fascinated. Stoic glared at him. "What do ye want with me, ya devil?" he growled. The young man growled back in similar tones and edged forwards in a curious four-legged fashion. His arms moved while his legs stretched as long as possible until he hoped to tuck them back under him or to the side of him, all the while his clawed gloves clinked against the floor. The movement was fluid, practiced, and natural, save for a slight drag of his left foot. He often moved with all his limbs like this, like a dragon. He was circling Stoic, watching him out of the slits in his mask, head still tilting from time to time. Stoic kept him in his sight until the large four-winged beast entered the room with the other rider on its back. He crouched also and stayed motionless and vigilant behind a raised shield while the smaller, younger man circled him with his dragonish gait. One dragon broke the line with a growl and made to prowl Stoic also. The young man hissed at the dragon breaking rank and stood on two legs to leap over to it. His arms landed first, swinging his lower body and legs around to land before the dragon's face. On all fours once again as he stood before it, his face in the dragon's to express or challenge his dominance, his back to Stoic as he faced down the rouge dragon. Stoic would have taken the chance to take out the threat when hot breath went down the nape of his neck. The night fury was leering over him, eyes narrowed as he protected his rider. Then the four-winged beast made itself known, hanging from the roof and fluttering its head fans threateningly. It was a chain of protection. That thought alone made Stoic hesitate. Dragons protecting. But they were savage killing machines who ate like gluttonous pigs. Thieves and murderers, they had no loyalty except to themselves, so why was this night fury acting so protective? And how did the young man know that he was safe with his back turned? The young man reached out to the dragon, making a low crooning noise, soothing and almost too low for Stoic to hear. The dragon tried to push him to the side. The man grabbed two of the stony lumps on its face and used all his weight and strength to push it to the floor, trying to make it submit with his bare hands. He growled and barked sternly while trailing off into a warning hiss. The dragon kept glaring at the Viking chief and moved to throw the young man off. But the human held firm and shoved him back down to the ground after the dragon had finished tossing its head and the human around like a terrier dog. The young man raised a hand over the dragon's face, drawing its eyes and making its pupils rise up to the top of its skull to keep track. Then the first knuckle tapped between the eyes with lightning speed and probably great force, and the dragon flopped onto its belly with its eyes big and round, humming like a contented dog before an open fire with a bone fresh from the slaughterhouse. While Stoic stared, the young man rubbed his hand up and down the dragon's great jaw and pressed his forehead against the nose, humming sadly and exhaling in several loud sighs. His mask nuzzled the creature and his entire body sagged. Stoic warily realized that he didn't want the dragon to attack, and was sad that he had to render it helpless in a trance. The man's face snapped back to Stoic and he resumed his prowl back to the night fury, who wrapped his tail around the human as the human stood up, with a slight crouch that spoke silent threats to the Viking. He clicked his glove claws together twice and made a defensive huff. The night fury shook his head angrily and snarled, but didn't advance. Finally the leader moved off the four-winged beast. He moved to stand at a half-crouch also, and shook his staff. A soft rattle filled the air. Several dragons inhaled and ignited their fire, letting it burn in their jaws and provide some light in the cave topped with ice. Stoic backed off in surprise. The illumination allowed him to see the pair more clearly, and the night fury was no longer a shadow in the darkness. Stoic glared at them both. "Who are ye?" The young man hissed at his booming voice and the night fury reared up to appear bigger. The leader moved to the man's side and held a hand out to keep them contained. They listened to him. The four-winged beast was eerily silent, just like its master. Stoic took a random guess. "Drago Bloodfist's men?" he asked. The night fury stiffened and snarled with pearly white teeth while the human shrieked at the name, letting out a duet of snarls and motions that corrected Stoic's statement. If he didn't know any better, he was sure that this pair were insulting the man and wishing for his death. The leader laughed suddenly. Stoic realized with a start that the leader was a female. She stood tall and took a side step as an approach. "No. Drago Bloodfist wants to kill us," she informed him softly, her voice muffled by the mask. "Murderer," hissed the other man, the first Norse word he had spoken. Stoic jumped at the sound of it. It was growled. It may as well have not been a word. It was as if the word was said in all the wrong areas of the mouth. The especially was clearly in the back of the throat, a growling snarl of hate. It was not at all like the near-perfect Norse of the woman leader. The woman titled her head and gently laid her shield on the ground. A sign of peace. Stoic took his chance and lunged at her. A black tail whacked his face and sent him off course. The chief lay sprawled with the unexpected blow, his leap left him unable to land on his feet with the unexpected change of direction. All the dragons roared and many took flight and began to swarm him. Then the young man was on his chest, snarling behind the mask with one hand on his chest to hold him steady while the other held a clawed hand over his head, ready to strike. Behind him the Night Fury stood, its weight on his legs and his mouth open in the promise of a deadly strike should his rider miss. Then the leader barked, then called out in Norse, "Stop." The young man tilted his head towards the woman, his attention was half diverted since he was watching Stoic out of the corner of his eye. But the gesture was enough to show she had his attention. The Night Fury didn't budge while his rider's attention was elsewhere, leaving Stoic pinned helplessly. The woman banged her staff on the ground and settled the roaring dragons. With commanding motions she had them assemble in the circle they stood in previously. Only the human and the Night Fury remained unmoved. The woman crouched low and let out several croons and hums. She tapped the earth before her and then spoke with a soft voice, "It is okay, son." The young man glanced between Stoic and his supposed mother. The Night Fury nudged his back to get him to listen. When he met her eyes once more she beckoned welcomingly. The young man rolled off Stoic and the Night Fury backed off with him. They backed without taking their eyes off their prey. The woman moved to stand in between the both of them and the young man rose to look her in the eye, and to trill inquisitively. "He attacked you, mum," he partly hissed and partly whimpered. His emotions made the words messy, yet clear. Stoic realized he said it in Norse specifically so he would get the message. He was not to mess with either of them. The woman's hand rose and rested on his shoulder, silently comforting and forgiving. The man leaned his head into his shoulder, trapping her hand briefly between both as he showed wordless affection. She then did the same for the dragon, letting her staff fall to the floor. The dragon looked at her too, then sat and leaned into her hand with his eyes closed. The young man took a step closer and leaned his head on her shoulder while muttering too low for Stoic to hear. The woman squeezed the arm around his shoulders, ran her hand back across the Night Fury's skull like petting a cat, making him relax. She nodded deeply at them both, then approached on her own while her son slipped back beneath the Night Fury's wing and watched intensely from under the protection of the devil. The masked eyes twinkling and the poison-green eyes of the dragon intense, but calm. The woman waited until Stoic had stood up again and then spoke. "If you do not attack, neither will we." "We." It was a very powerful "we," as she spoke for her son, his demonic pet, her mount who had been skulking around the room, and the other dragons breathing their own flames. Stoic had no choice. He nodded just the once. The woman was still for a moment, then she chuckled. "I never thought I'd see you agree to not attack a dragon on sight." Stoic dismissed the jibe. "Who are ye?" he demanded at last. "You seem to know me." He wished he had his axe. The woman sighed. I do." She reached up and pulled off her helmet, ducking into her hands before lifting her face from the blue bug mask. She then looked him in the eye. "I did marry you." Stoic gasped, then gasped again, taking a step back. Before him was his wife, Valka. His heat simultaneously stopped and started. Her smooth, pale skin, her long brown hair, now with traces of grey, her large green eyes and narrow chin, her slim build, her delicate hands, her slight grace as she raised a hand to shush him as his alarm grew. It was her. She glanced down, looking uncomfortable before she licked her lips, that gesture she always did when she was nervous. Stoic swallowed. You. He took off his helmet and pressed it to his panicking heart. She raised her hand once again to ask for his silence. "Don't." "I know what you're gonna say, Stoic," she said, sounding vulnerable now her mask was gone. She looked down and impersonated weakly. "How could I have done this?" Valka's shoulders slumped and she let out a breath before sucking it in and continuing as emotionless as possible. "Stayed away all these years, and why didn't I come back to you?" She gasped again and clutched the mask closer to her. Her breathing hitched. Stoic listened to her self-accusations and knew, because he knew her so well, that she was accusing and punishing herself too for her choice. What demon was she fighting right now? How had she handled the guilt? Why didn't she come back? She held her head high stubbornly. "Well, what sign did I have that you could change, Stoic?" that anyone on Burke could. She turned the argument around. He knew and remembered how much she had pleaded her case, begged for a chance, every time she was laughed at and turned away. She was an outcast to her own people, making peace with dragons, and yet, here she was, peacefully with them. Stoic took it all in with an empty mind as he struggled to accept the fact that she was standing right before him, living her beliefs. Her beliefs, so wrong, mystical, and fanciful that they were dangerous, but look at her and all around her. What had she done? How much had she reshaped the world? How much had she been living a truth he never considered possible? Her eyes were teary. I pleaded, so many times, to stop the fighting, to find another answer, but did any of you listen? She snapped, bordering on hysteria. Stoic took a step towards her, wanting to stop her crying. Valka took a step back and clutched her mask between them as if it would shield her. It was wrong of me to let you believe I was dead, but you wouldn't have understood. None of you could ever understand what I've been through, what we've been through, what I've discovered. I found the answer, but you weren't ready. She stopped backing up as more tears escaped. She looked at her husband with wide eyes that pierced Stoic's heart. She should not fear him. Valka sobbed and shook her head. Don't be so stoic, Stoic, she pleaded. Shout, scream, say something. Just. Stoic cut her off when his free hand rose to cup her cheek. She was real. He took his own shuddering breath as she watched him with terrified eyes. He wanted to say so many things. He wanted to ask her why, to have her explain and reason. But all the locked-up words in his heart were silent. He finally, gruffly, spoke. You're as beautiful as the day I lost your. Valka's eyes went wide, then she closed her eyes as tears leaked down her high cheekbones. She finally leaned into his touch. The dragons were irrelevant to him now. He brought their faces closer together. She still had to look up to reach him, and kissed her for the first time in 20 years. She returned the brief kiss, and when they parted, all the dragons were humming and cooing and slowly filtering away, save for the pair who belonged to the riders. The chief breathed deeply as he tried to ride the wave of emotion. Oh Val, my dear. Valka gasped a strangled smile and wiped at her eyes. Oh, look at me. I was so sure I could do this. Calmly she turned away a little before smiling at him. Stoic. How are ye alive? I saw you being taken away, he gasped out. Valka looked up at the four-winged dragon who was happily leaning down from the ceiling. Cloudjumper never meant to harm me. He was looking to stop the fighting too, searching for another answer. The beast's golden eyes were glowing, but soft, while Valka spoke of him. Stoic glanced between them in confusion. He was there that night to speak to the other dragons, to ask them to give up their fight and go with him for a better life. Not all had the ability to leave with him, but some did. Then he heard a babe crying, all alone and afraid, and went to protect it. She smiled over her shoulder at the young boy sitting with a curious night fury. Stoic's heart leapt into his mouth. Hiccup, he gasped, dropping his helmet and covering his aging heart in shock. With Valka's unmasking, he had forgotten about the younger man. The young man stiffened at the name and backed into the Night Fury's wings, clearly uncomfortable with Stoic looking at him like that. He gave a low keen and the Night Fury wrapped his tail around the masked man, nuzzling his mask as he did so to try and bring him comfort. The man nuzzled back. Valka gave Stoic an apologetic look. Yes. He's just nervous, she excused. Stoic kept staring at Hiccup. His son was alive, his heir and baby, though clearly not a babe anymore. He looked on with a pained expression when Hiccup kept hiding from him. Valka tucked her hair behind her ear. When I saw Cloudjumper breaking into the house, I rushed to protect our son, but what I saw. Cloudjumper was playing with Hiccup. She laughed, as if she could barely believe it after all this time. Stoic blinked a few times and looked up at the beast. Valka smiled at him too. He was making sure Hiccup was no longer afraid. What I saw was proof of everything I believed. Cloudjumper hummed lowly and purred through a peculiar nose. Hiccup looked up at him and hooted back, making Cloudjumper snort and deadpan at the youth. The Night Fury broke into a gummy smile as his master laughed. Cloudjumper leered down and made a low noise of annoyance. Hiccup rolled out from under his dragon's wing and lay looking up at the four-winged beast. Stoic imagined a wide smile on a face he didn't know. Hiccup raised his hands just as Cloudjumper lowered a claw. Hiccup batted with the claw like a cat would with a loose string. Cloudjumper made a few playful jabs at Hiccup's chest. But it was enough to make Stoic worried. He moved to stop them, but Valka took Stoic's hand. They are only playing, Stoic. He is not a savage beast, but an intelligent, gentle creature. His soul reflected my own. She and the creature shared a meaningful look. We are the same. We want peace, we want to find another answer, to see other lands, to protect what we believe in, to protect our own. We are both fierce and gentle, and he loves our son as dearly as I do, treating us like his family. I couldn't kill him that night when I saw myself in his eyes. Stoic felt confused and slightly angry at the calm, deep understanding and trust that went between his wife and the beast who took her. His hands tightened on hers. Then, why did he take you away? He asked. If he understood you so well, why didn't he understand that you had family there? Valka looked regretful. When you rushed to defend us, Cloudjumper decided that here was too dangerous for such gentle souls as me and our son. We're too different, Stoic. Hiccup and I would have never have been happy on Berk, the land of kill or be killed. We were just born different. When I snatched Hiccup from the cradle to get him out of the burning building, Cloudjumper snatched me, and off we were, forever. She let Stoic's hands go and placed one on his face. It broke my heart to stay away, but after a few days here I knew we'd be safer and happier if we stayed away from that dreadful place. Stoic took in her explanations with a heavy load of sadness. She believed in peace so much that she wouldn't return to the battlefield where he had been mourning her. Valka believed that Hiccup, heir of Berk, would have been unhappy at home, their ancestral home. He would have been happier amongst, supposedly, peaceful dragons. It was a heavy blow to his pride. But Valka, it's our home, Hiccup's home. Hiccup shook his head mutely, his night fury curling its tail around him possessively while Valka looked at Stoic with her large, sad, green eyes. No, Stoic. We don't belong there. As soon as I was over the kidnapping I realized that I'd never felt so peaceful here. She looked around the cave. I was living with peaceful dragons, my dream, with no fear of Hiccup being harmed by Viking or dragon, and he was free to grow as he wished, outside your Viking norms. I realized once we had lived here for many years, we're not Vikings, and we never have been. She held his hand once again. Home is where you feel you belong. I belong here, Hiccup belongs here. Stoic felt more and more sadness building on him. Val. He looked down and knew it would be a while before he could accept her reasoning, if he ever could, but he knew she was unhappy with Berk's dragon-killing ways, even in her youth. But dragons were more likely to eat a person than care for them. Dragons are extremely dangerous. How did you survive? With a baby. Valka laughed and rolled her eyes. The dragons are kind, amazing creatures. If you respond in violence they'll defend themselves. If you respond to them in friendship and trust then they'll be loyal till their dying breaths. She looked up at her dragon and moved to him to place her hand to his nose and gently scratch under his chin. He hummed with half-closed eyes. Cloudjumper never meant us ill or harm. He just thought we belonged here, in the home of the great bewilderbeast. Come, let me show you. She reached out a hand to him. Stoic shook his head and rubbed his temple. It's a lot to take in. Valka smiled. I understand, but please, come. This way, she called and took off running down a corridor of stone. Hiccup looked up and followed her, running on 2 legs, but using 4 to jump off rocks in the way, and through small gaps. His night fury called after him, then dived through a neighboring tunnel, as did the 4-winged beast. Stoic felt his heart wrench when his wife and son vanished from sight. He snapped out of his mournful state and followed them. Wait. Valka. Where are you going? He squeezed after his nimble wife and son, pushing past rocks and through ice until he spotted them again. Hiccup was in front of Valka, hiding behind her so she was between Stoic and himself. He tensed when he appeared and ran ahead. Valka just smiled. Come, this way, she called again and jumped from foothold to foothold as gracefully as a leaping goat, all the way down towards a light exit. Hiccup, however, moved like nothing Stoic had ever seen. He jumped like Valka, gripped onto ice and stone with clawed hands, and twisted in midair like a dragon to land at the right angle. He disappeared into a vertical tunnel and was pulled up by a black tail. Valka led Stoic along a few more paces, up a steep stack of stone and then out into an area bathed in light. Stoic had to crawl through the final gap, but when he exited his eyes went wide in amazement at what he saw. There was ice covering the ceiling and huge stacks of rock and land that served as pillars to the ceiling, each bit of land covered in lush grass or moss and flowers. It was a tropical paradise. There was a waterfall below with a lake that filled the lower sections. There were caves and rocks as the ice enclosed a mountainside and a number of sea stacks. There were holes in the ice on the ceiling where golden sunlight filtered through. The top was above the clouds to only filter through sunlight. Then there were thousands of dragons, flying, relaxing, sitting, wrestling, flaming, scratching and, dare he say it, playing. There was every different type he could imagine, gronkles, nadders, ziplybacks, monstrous nightmares, terrible terrors, thunderdrums, whispering deaths, timberjacks, chain-chewings, who promptly disappeared, and many, many more. Stoic could only stare. His hand twitched for his battle axe, which wasn't there. His first instinct was to defend or fight, but his second reaction was to just stare in pure amazement. Valhalla, he whispered. He could have believed such a place was part of heaven, if there weren't so many dragons. There was a chuckle above him. He turned and saw his wife sitting on the four-winged beast, whose horned head turned from upside down to look at him right way up. His eyes were merely curious, there was no malice. Stoic looked at his wife, who now wore a different coat of leather armor and a fur ruff for the back of her head and neck. She still carried her staff, but now wore a white cloth and brown leather skirt with a hint of other clothes beneath her lighter armor. Stoic realized with a pang that it made her look as if she really did belong here, wild, and spur of the moment, with natural colors and inspiration. "This is where you've been for 20 years, he asked. Valka nodded, looking excited and expectant. Stoic swallowed. "You've been living with them? Protecting them?" he asked, a hint of betrayal in his voice. Valka nodded once again. Stoic looked away and stumbled over to a rock to sit down. "This is a bit much to get my head around. My own wife a dragon protector, a traitor, and my own son a crazy, feral, vigilante dragon boy." He buried his face into his hands and shuddered. Valka winced and said, "Oh, Stoic." She looped her staff around her dragon's claw and had him lower her to the ground. She slid off his wing and landed as if she had merely stepped out of bed. She knelt in a crouch and sent a small smile up to Hiccup, who had been camouflaged with his night fury in the shadows in the ceiling. She weakly chuckled. "At least we're not boring, right?" she offered, as if trying to make him laugh. Stoic grunted. "Well, there's that." Valka approached warily. "You're not upset?" Stoic wrung his hands. "Of course I'm upset," he shouted. "I can't believe you would betray your people, everything we stood for, let our son, my heir, become an animal." Valka growled, a surprising sound that shut Stoic up. "My son is not an animal. He just grew up with dragons, he known very little human ways other than what I've shown him. He's so happy here, content. He hates unnecessary killing and violence, and only defends his family." "Don't you do the same?" she demanded. Stoic tried to protest but fumbled. He did do the same. He defended his family and didn't like unnecessary killing of people. He gruffly cleared his throat to argue his point, but his so-called family are dragons. Valka looked cross and, she challenged. Stoic grunted. "They're animals. They're amazing creatures who can love, nurture, teach and care. They feel, like us, can get sick and injured like us, and their blood runs as red as ours. Our souls are alike, our hearts work the same, they are intelligent, more so than you Vikings ever could be with your kill-on-sight philosophy." She looked scornful. Stoic rubbed his forehead. Valka placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Stoic, please. Let me show you, that's why we brought you here, to stop you going to Drago and to show you a better way. Dragons and people are just the names of the two different shells which hold the same essence," she explained in her curious way. "So you Viking, exactly what drew him to her when they were young. She was so different and brave and challenging, longing for peace and taming his frightful temper. That was why he loved her, she hadn't changed." Valka was waiting for his response. Stoic examined her large, worried eyes, and realized that she was putting her secrecy, her home and its safety and even her dragon family at risk as she had revealed it all to a Viking. A Viking chief, at that, who hated dragons and killed them on sight. She must feel endangered and vulnerable. He wouldn't endanger her. But what could she say to change his mind? Nothing. It would change nothing, therefore there was no harm in trying. Stoic sighed deeply and nodded. "Just the once. Very well, my dear, for you, anything," he vowed, though there would still be great amounts of reluctance in whatever she tried to involve him with. Valka smiled in relief and threw her arms around him. "Thank you. Thank you for giving me a chance." She pulled away and took his hand. "This is my home, do you like it?" Stoic stayed seated as he looked around. "I don't have the words," he admitted. Slowly several dragons began to approach. They snuck out of the undergrowth and out of caves and over the cliff ledge, looking curious. Stoic backed up a little and put up his fists. Valka covered his hands. No, no. They're just curious, she insisted. They haven't seen many humans, many kind ones anyway, she added, reaching out to pet one's nose. Kind ones? Stoic asked. Valka stiffly stood and looked at him with restrained anger. Drago. Him and his repulsive trappers want dragons. He wants to hunt us down, and destroy our sanctuary. See here, she approached a large blue dragon who was sitting awkwardly. It had a boulder-spiked tail and a tough-looking nose and jaw. Its yellow eye revealed pain. Hiccup dropped down onto its back and ran a soothing hand over its neck, crooning lowly. He caught a dribble of water from an icicle and rubbed it into his neck, making the beast groan and shiver in delight. The youth was trying to alleviate the pain. Valka rubbed its jaw while gesturing to a stump leg that had been wrapped in bandages, bloody bandages. This Snafflefang lost a leg to one of Drago Bloodfist's iron traps. She sounded so pitying and sad. It rubbed back against her hand and Hiccup slid down its wing and lightly inspected the wrapped limb, still crooning sadly like he was sharing his pain and loss. When the beast turned its head to see him, Hiccup raised a hand and rested it on its face, still being sympathetic and gentle. The simple trust and understanding between the two beings was powerful in the humble touch. Valka turned to another dragon, this one with a long neck and a long face with a jaw that opened all the way to where its neck connected. It was duller in color, a mossy green-brown. It watched as Valka approached. She used her staff to lift a torn and ruined wing. This rain-cutter had a wing slashed by razor netting. The dragon groaned in a deep voice when the wing was raised, pained by the movement. Valka extended her arm to a final dragon with a flaring head crest, horse-like long face, taloned teeth and white eyes. She whimpered without realizing, and this poor hobble grunt was blinded by a tree snare. The dragon's crest flared as he leaned into her scent, his scales changing color from a purple-blue-orange to a yellow-black-green as it nuzzled into her arms, shivering. Then left to die, alone and scared, she planted a kiss on his scales. Such injuries were common amongst the people of Berk, but to see dragons suffering the same made Stoic feel strange. He had seen how people had struggled to live with a lost leg like his best friend Gobber the Belch, or without sight like Frida the Acid Hunter. Hiccup lowered his head and rubbed his left leg. Valka moved over to him and patted his leg too, Hiccup leaning his forehead against her shoulder, through a mask, showing the need for comfort. The Snafflefang breathed hot air onto his back and the hobble grunt lowered his chin to the ground, sniffing loudly. Valka put both arms around her son, looking torn between furious and miserable. Once, Hiccup was caught in an earth jaw. His leg was clamped between two metal teeth. If it weren't for the dragon scales on his armor, he would have lost it then and there. As it was, he was deeply cut and bleeding enough to turn the sea red. Hiccup stiffened and kept glancing down. She looked up at a horrified Stoic. It wasn't placed where a dragon would stand. It was designed for us. Drago knows we protect and free dragons. He hunts us, and wants to hurt us. The trappers attacked and tried to take his life, and later I feared Hiccup would lose his leg. He was only 15. Hiccup removed his odd boot and revealed several ugly, twisted scars from where the teeth had cut him, and where he had obviously been ripped free. The Night Fury approached from behind as Hiccup pulled his boot back on. The beast licked his cheek and neck with a slightly forked tongue, tenderly. Hiccup hummed and butted his head into the Night Fury's, his hands coming up to scratch his chin. The Night Fury suddenly pounced and wriggled his head under Hiccup to seat him on his back. Hiccup laughed and hummed, scratching his mount's jaw vigorously from his position, the dragon rearing up to get closer to him and the scratching. Valka laughed and joined in. If it weren't for this Night Fury, toothless, she chuckled when he perked up at his name. Hiccup would have bled to death. Stoic blinked and tried to see how or why the dragon would do such a thing. Valka could have read his mind with her next words. Hiccup freed him from an old abandoned trap. The tiny little dragon had been stuck there for weeks with both wings badly broken. We took him home and Hiccup nursed him back to health. I feared he'd never fly again with the state of his withered wings, but Hiccup never doubted and taught the hatchling to fly. She sounded so proud. They've been together ever since. Hiccup wrapped both arm and leg around the Night Fury's neck. I save his life, he saves mine, he spoke. Stoic jumped at his voice. Hiccup wasn't looking at him, though it was clear his words were directed to him. That's how it works. His voice was strong, but strange. The syllables were drawled and oddly flat, like everything he was saying in Norse was sarcastic. Nothing like the rich, honest tones of his growls and dragon noises. Valka chuckled yes. Having gained his loyalty and trust when Hiccup fell prey to that human trap, Toothless returned the favor out of love and worry for his safety. He could have just flown away, and left Hiccup to those murderous trappers, but no. He stayed loyal to the end. He defended my boy when I was helpless, and put himself in danger, but they are a pair, their souls are the same and together they will, that's the beauty of dragon's loyalty, she whispered at the end, Cloudjumper cooing from above in agreement. Hiccup slid from Toothless' back and butted heads once more. He looked at Stoic properly and said, once you've earned a dragon's loyalty, there is nothing he won't do for you. Stoic looked into his eyes and saw how the dragon guarded him, constantly protecting him, sheltering him, demanding attention and returning it. They trusted each other as solidly as Stoic trusted his good right hook. They cared for each other's emotions, well-being, health and so much more. Valka moved back into his line of sight. Is this what you meant by another way? He asked, gesturing to the pair who were so in sync that when one moved the other adjusted without realizing that they were doing it. Hiccup moved his hand, the Night Fury's tail moved to angle his body. Toothless' head snapped to something that had grabbed his attention. Hiccup's feet shifted in the earth, ready to act if Toothless acted. Valka's eyes lit up at his question. That is only part of it, the most beautiful part, but there's so much more, she insisted, taking his hand and leading him through a crowd of dragons, which Stoic no longer feared would eat him on sight, and took him to the edge of the cliff where a small path was. Here I've discovered so many things, and it's all because the Alpha allowed me to stay with my infant. She pointed down into the pools. Stoic looked and froze, gasping loudly. Mother of Thor, he spluttered, standing back. The white dragon below was as large as a mountain. Its back was covered in spines that went grey and rusty red at the tips. Its head was colossal with a mane of spikes from its head like the blasts of ice in the ceiling, also tipped dark and red. Its legs were stout for its long, large body made of pure muscle and weight, and scales as fine as the ones on a Night Fury. There was a beard of small spikes on its face, while the main feature of his face were the tusks the size of ships. The monstrously sized dragon, for it was clearly a dragon, was submerged in water, with a long tail that looked adapted for swimming, and it appeared to be asleep. Valka chuckled at her husband's response and placed a hand on his forearm. It's okay, Stoic. This is our chief, the great bewilderbeast. She gestured to him proudly. The Alpha species, one of the very few which still exist. Stoic grasped onto her wonder and fascination like a lifeline. He had to cling to something as his world and values were tipped more and more off balance. He looked back at her. The chief. Valka nodded. Every nest has its queen, but this is the king of all dragons, she declared with pride. She looked up and pointed to the ice in the sanctuary with his icy breath. This graceful giant built our nest, a safe haven for dragons everywhere. And, myself and Hiccup, of course, she added with a chuckle, leading Stoic down a fallen sea stack closer to the beast. Stoic kept his wide eyes on it. An ice dragon. A king. He's been keeping you here, he demanded. Valka shook her head. No, I decided I would stay long before I could understand him. If any dragon wanted to leave, he would bid them well and let them go. He doesn't hurt dragons or Vikings. He is wise, gentle, caring, and truly treasures those in his nest. He protects us. She defended him with her characteristic way with words. All Stoic could do was listen. Valka looked wonder-struck again. We all live under his care, and his command. Hiccup and the Night Fury suddenly came barreling past, pursued by a number of bulgy-eyed, two-legged dragons who were constantly chirping and squawking. Hiccup slipped and was buried under them, hands raised to fend for himself. Stoic moved to help, but Valka steadied him. All but the babies, of course. Cloudjumper and Toothless pounced on the babies, scaring them off to take refuge on the king's face. Hiccup sat up looking a little ruffled but not hurt. He was shaking with silent laughter and at once started roaring challenges to the little baby dragons. Toothless jumped a few times and roared too, expanding his wings to look bigger. Valka and Stoic ducked as the little dragons moved to the king's face. Valka cooed at once at their sweetness, who listened to no one. She chuckled. Stoic managed to crack a small smile at the recklessness of the situation. There were adult dragons bowing with wings defenselessly spread, respecting and paying homage to this awe-inspiring creature, and then there were the babies who were as large as Viking teens running amok on the king's tucks and jumping on his spikes with gurgles of fun. The king's icy white eyes with slits for pupils opened to watch them play. He allowed it for a moment, then let out a gentle grunt to send them scurrying along, with all the gentleness of a leader ushering a child back to its mother. The being then caught sight of the small troop approaching. Hiccup removed his helmet and dropped it at his side. Stoic couldn't stare at his own boy yet, the beast had moved to directly look at him. The Night Fury and the four-winged beast bowed with the same respect as the other adults, humming lowly in greeting. Hiccup swept his arms around his sides, like wings, before bringing them forwards to cross at the wrists as he bowed on one knee. Valka did the same while holding her staff, bowing with respect and humming low in her throat. Stoic hesitated before standing his ground. The large eyes focused on him and he stared back, feeling uncharacteristically open. Stoic was his name, stoic was his nature, but before this creature he wasn't a stone of contained thought and emotion. Instead he was open like the pages of a book, helpless to stop the wild wind from turning them to glimpse at the secrets in ink. The bewildered beast looked at him for a long time before breathing a puff of icy air. Stoic cringed when the whiteness of his breath touched him, but only a touch of frost littered his beard. He was unharmed. Valka looked delighted. He likes you, she whispered before bowing again, hands and knees and letting out a wordless sound of joy and gratitude. He says he'll let you stay, to learn and to change. He believes you can. Stoic breathed out in amazement as he wiped away the frost from his beard. Odin's sword. He whispered, feeling unexpectedly and reluctantly honored to have won the approval of a creature beyond human intelligence. The beast then turned to Hiccup, and Stoic followed his gaze to look at his unmasked son for the first time. Hiccup looked exactly like Valka. He looked up at the king and watched him with wide eyes. His face was smooth and pale like hers, with some residual freckles from his youth. There was a tiny scar on the right of his chin, a line of white on tan skin. His hair was brown with streaks of auburn, it grew in locks that looked windblown and barely tamed. Valka must have cut it short. There was a hint of stubble on his jaw, which was strong like his own, and his nose was also like Stoic's. His eyes were a luminous green like his wife's with a forest green depth. His body was lean and toned, and perfectly balanced. He looked strong and confident, and moved like a dragon and a human. The king let out a deep rumble and let out another puff of air. Hiccup reached up to the cool air and trained his glove claws through it, getting frost on them also. He looked at the frost on his hand, fascinated, then turned back to the king and drilled a question. Stoic wondered how he could make such noises. It was like he had several voice boxes and two tongues. The king and Hiccup shared another long look, understanding and communication passing between them on a level beyond Stoic's comprehension. Then Hiccup lowered his head and closed his eyes, a hand touching his chest, over his heart, and he exhaled loudly before humming. Reluctance but obedience, perhaps even understanding mixed throughout. The king tilted his head and the tusk moved before the young human. Hiccup raised his head and his eyes widened slightly, then a smile of awe passed over his face. Hiccup put both hands on the tusk, as he had the Night Fury's face, and rested his forehead against it. A gesture so symbolic and powerful in its simplicity, both Stoic and Valka were unable to break the silence that surrounded it. Toothless raised his head and let out a soft call too. The king actually closed his eyes to Toothless in respect, and Toothless was also allowed to touch the king. He rubbed his head along the tusk like a cat, respectful, loving and trusting. The king rumbled deeply, casting his eyes to Cloudjumper and Valka once more before withdrawing, after making sure that Hiccup and Toothless were a safe distance from his massive form. He retreated back to his pond and slowly walked deeper into the ocean, slowly submerging until only his white shadowy tail remained trailing behind him. Stoic was still staring. Hiccup looked at Stoic with the strength of an animal in his eyes, unafraid to make eye contact, and simply looking without feeling. He stood upright. He was only slightly shorter than Valka, and seemed to critically cast his eyes up and down the man. Toothless watched from just behind him, looking curious but wary. Stoic swallowed and tried to approach his boy. After the first step Hiccup tensed, his entire body jerked with the movement of every limb growing as taut as a bowstring. Stoic took another step and held out a hand, unsure if he wanted to embrace him or simply touch him. But that proved a step too far for the boy. His eyes widened, then narrowed and he dived under Toothless' swing once again, his face set into a mistrustful glare. Toothless angled Hiccup away from Stoic and breathed on Hiccup's neck gently. Hiccup growled several short times at Stoic, before glancing at his mother and looking down ashamed. Valka smiled and knelt from where she stood. She snapped her fingers to get his attention and hummed at him while nodding slowly and respectfully. Hiccup relaxed, cracked a crooked smile that lit up his whole face, then made an odd gurgle through an open mouth before Toothless knocked him over with a playful nudge. Stoic looked helplessly at Valka. She looked apologetic as she stood by his side once more. The Alpha asked Hiccup to get to know you, and told him that only through him can you understand us. He forbade him from leaving the nest while you are a guest. But Hiccup is uncomfortable, he knows you have killed dragons. He feels guilty for failing a request. She finished. The chief felt a rock settle in his chest. His legendary skill was driving a wedge between his family. He knew that Hiccup must see him as a murderer. He had voiced as much before. Also, he was only willing to let Stoic reasonably close because a dragon had ordered him to. He wasn't sad that he wasn't getting along with him, he was sad to disappoint a dragon. Stoic watched as his son and Night Fury copied each other's head-bobbing movements, accompanied by croaks and gurgles. Yeah, they said before Toothless shook his head vigorously. Hiccup smiled and chirped before running away and hiding behind Cloudjumper. Toothless gave chase and bounded around the older dragon with his tongue lolling out of his mouth. Hiccup popped out from under one wing, then hid again while appearing under another, laughing the entire time. Toothless crooned constantly. Cloudjumper looked bored and aloof, but the adults saw how he constantly shifted his wings to keep the young ones away from his claws. Stoic cleared his throat loudly. The two froze and Hiccup looked defensive, unsure and uncomfortable. Stoic sighed, son. Hiccup stiffened and growled no, he growled. The sound was deep in his throat, nearly in his chest. He did not like being claimed as such. Stoic nodded. I'm your father. Hiccup's shoulders rose in the place of hackles, both dragons watching the exchange with warily curious expressions. Hiccup let out several loud clicking noises before hissing and looking conflicted. Not family, he protested, backing up several steps alone. Stoic nodded. You are my son. Hiccup let out another distressed whine and looked to his mother for help. She gestured to Stoic with an encouraging expression. Hiccup met the chief's eyes and peered long and hard. He tilted his head slightly at the hand extended to him and looked so torn. Stoic stayed as still as his name. Hiccup finally moved. But it was towards his helmet. He looked down at the helmet and then at Stoic. He looked sadly at his mother and shook his head with a sigh. Vikings don't understand. Stoic withdrew sadly. Valka looked sad. Help him understand, she coaxed. Hiccup glared at them both. He doesn't want to understand dragons, he accused. He wants to understand me. He made a spitting, snarling noise. He sees Viking child. I'm not Viking. I'm not one of them. He was getting distressed. Toothless slinked over and twined around Hiccup's back, pressing his head into his hip while his body supported him. Hiccup looked at him with a face full of hopelessness and burden. He knelt and put his hands around the dragon's neck. The dragon returned the embrace by lowering a wing and pressing his head into Hiccup's body. Stoic felt Valka place a hand on his arm. He is right though, you need to stop seeing him as a Viking. Hiccup has a dragon's soul, a dragon's heart, a dragon's mind, and yet each one is also a blend of human too. Stoic looked at a loss. I don't understand, he admitted. Valka sighed. You got off on the wrong foot. She smiled at him calmingly. Change his mind as he is meant to change yours, she suggested. Stoic rubbed his forehead. Still cryptic, he complained. Valka laughed. Stoic looked back at his son, who was cautiously waiting with his dragon curled around him once again. The chief felt sad that there was such distance between him and the boy. Fathers and sons were supposed to be close, they were meant to support each other, take advice and give it, learn and be proud of the other. Then, eventually, the son would step up to fill his father's shoes. Had he missed his chance? Stoic fell to his knees and breathed deeply as he felt the loss between them more solidly than a wall. Valka had had such a hard time conceiving a child, then when he was born it was feared he would die, and now it seemed he had lost what he wanted most. And he would never get a son or family back because he was a Viking. How had being a Viking seemed such a proud thing this morning and such a shameful thing a few hours later. I'm sorry. He took a deep breath. I'm sorry for kicking you, for attacking your mother, for calling you an animal, and for being a Viking. I'm sorry I can't understand. His next words were full of loss and grief and sadness. I'm so sorry. If Stoic had been looking up he would have seen pure shock on Hiccup's face, and the same on the Night Fury's face, tinged with slight innocent curiosity. Hiccup looked at Valka, who was also looking surprised. Hiccup then looked at Toothless, who purred deeply before lightly pressing his shoulder with his nose. Hiccup then looked back at the deeply sad chief. Stoic heard a familiar click of dragon claws hitting each other, and looked up to see Hiccup crouching not an arm's length away from him. Stoic blinked and gasped softly. Hiccup's face was intently looking at him, reading him as deeply as the Alpha had. Then he hummed low in his throat and pulled off one glove with his teeth, his left hand, and held it out to the chief, palm up. Stoic looked at the hand curiously, not held like one about to shake hands, but then placed his larger one into the offered hand. Hiccup's hand was warm, and a mixture of soft and tough. Hiccup stood and pulled the chief up with him. Stoic looked at his son as the youth nodded at him shortly. "Can change," he allowed before turning and rejoining his Night Fury. They rubbed cheeks like a pair of cats before Toothless looked out over the cave and bounced on his front paws while trilling. Hiccup followed his sight and trilled in an exact echo a moment before they took off, Hiccup clinging to the dragon's back as the beast jumped down the sea stack and bounded across the sanctuary to play. Stoic watched, still full of heartfelt gratitude. His son had at least accepted his apology, and had taken back his refusal to cooperate with him. They were by no means close, but Stoic could feel a potential there for the first time. He silently thanked the gods for this chance to have his family back. Valka leaned into Cloudjumper and he hummed. She chuckled and cooed back. The beast lowered his head before raising it to look above. She nodded and patted his wings, and he took off, leaving her with her husband. Valka approached Stoic and put a hand on his arm. He jumped. She moved like a dragon too, so stealthy. Her village clumsiness was long gone. She had truly thrived under these dragons. He felt a mixture of awe and frustration that she fit with his ancestral enemy so well. Valka ignored his inner turmoil and said, "There is a sort of house above. You'll want to stay there since you don't have a dragon to use as a bed," she considered aloud. "Follow me," she ordered. Stoic began to follow. A house. That implied a long stay. Stoic wondered if his men were worrying for him. Perhaps he could send them a message, or go in person before returning. In any case, it was clear that this would become a familiar place to him. Dragons and a Viking living under the same roof. My men would think I've lost my mind. Underscore 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 underscore. Stoic was meant to be helping clean out the sort of house Valka had led him to. But he was distracted. The house was probably what Valka had used when she had first arrived here in the Dragon Haven, trying to keep some kind of human lifestyle before the dragonish one took over. Or maybe it was most practical to raise a baby in a human home, then as the baby grew the home was needed less and less as he got more independent and less vulnerable. Either way, it was dusty and mossy and looked like it hadn't been used for years upon years. It only consisted of a semi-deep cave with a fire pit with a small chimney cut through rock by a very small whispering death infant, Valka told him. A wooden bed covered with furs, a few wonky wooden shelves and stone hollows, and a large table made from an old wrecked ship holding all kinds of unused pots, skins, knives and plates. Water trickled into the house down a melting icicle, and Stoic was sure that food was the only thing that had to be gathered elsewhere. Valka had led Stoic through an overgrown and rocky trail to this forgotten place, and had done so in silence, her eyes large and expressive in her voice's absence, like a dragon. She used her staff to vault and level her landings, only pausing now and then to make sure he followed. She jumped from foothold to foothold and paused to wait in crouches, her staff swinging in every direction for balance and her free hand gripping the undergrowth for support. Stoic watched in awe, and when she caught that look she would laugh or smile widely, glad to have impressed him. She clearly took pride in her changed lifestyle. Stoic lumbered up the hill. His bulk making him a slow mover, and even slower around the denser areas of plants should a dragon be lurking. But eventually they arrived at their destination. Upon arrival at the house, Stoic found it was a cave that was filled with human home-related items, everything covered in dust and mold, and the entrance covered in hanging vines and other plants. The entrance Valka had to reveal by knocking aside several large leaves. After revealing the cave, she took off her clay fabric armor shell and stood in a yellow tunic with a brown skirt and brown leggings and brown boots, all but the shirt had been homemade. Stoic remembered her wearing a similar yellow shirt on Burke. Maybe it was the same one. She ran a hand through her light brown hair and smiled slightly at him. It hasn't been needed for a long time. But I think it will be a decent guest house. We can add to it, of course. Oh, she stumbled over a forgotten wooden baby toy, a carving of a fish, as she led him inside. Her stumble made her frail like a fish out of water and knock several other items to the ground with her staff as she tried to regain balance with her makeshift tail. She blushed slightly and put her staff down carefully to stop herself making more mess. Stoic chuckled slightly. Suddenly it was his old Valka back again, the one who tripped over her own feet and hid in the more violent raids, and burnt everything she touched in the kitchen. Valka sent him a look when he laughed. "Don't start," she warned, but smiled just before turning away. It was all old jokes and forgotten rhythms. Missed banter. Valka and Stoic had at once set to work to make this unused place usable once again. Valka began gathering all unneeded baby items, cot, rags, old clothes, and some smaller child-sized furniture. She put them in a neighboring storage space. Stoic was given the task of ripping down the leaves that covered the entrance, then moving things outside so they could be dusted. But Stoic wasn't helping at the moment. He was watching Valka. He never realized how dearly he had missed the domestic sight of his wife tidying, tripping over her own feet and tools, and caring and making a home. She fussed over cleanliness and presentation of the home. Just as she had on Burke, the chief's wife, had to set an example. She sometimes fell short, but to Stoic nothing mattered other than her happiness. If she was happy with her house, then so should the village. They didn't live there. Who were they to judge? But the sweet homely scene wasn't the only thing that had caught his attention right now. Her housewife stumbling had returned. While that was familiar, it contrasted sharply with the graceful, stealthy exterior of her dragon vigilante persona. He noticed that she looked very out of place here. With dragons she was graceful and confident, but here she was too big. She didn't fit. It showed in how she moved, acted, thought, even spoke. With dragons she had the sky, sea, and all unmanned land to use as elbow room. Her arms would not hit walls and furniture like cage walls, and her thoughts could fill the sky like clouds. With dragons she was free of boundaries and constraints, and she fit in so perfectly it was as if she had been born human by mistake. Stoic felt the heavy weight of his own thoughts once again. Valka belonged with dragons. Could he call her his wife after this revelation? Was she even his if she belonged so perfectly with them? Valka was oblivious to Stoic's inner thoughts and took a dusty fur outside. "I'll have a dragon air this, and you should be able to live here comfortably," she informed him briskly, probably feeling happy like she sometimes did after her annual spring clean on Burke. She used to say she was cleaning out the old year in time for the new. She shook the bare fur a few times and odd bits of everything fell out, from dust to stones to small bones to leaves. Stoic blinked a few times and put down the pot he had forgotten he was dusting. "You, not we." "I should be able." "You're not living here with me?" he asked, catching on to her unconscious wording and stepping out behind her to get answers. Valka stiffened, just realizing her own subconscious plans herself. She ran a hand over her hair shakily and nodded. I thought you would, perhaps, want some time to yourself after all." This she gestured randomly, finding her own assumptions had made this an awkward situation. She intensely interested herself in the patting down of another fur, to not meet her husband's eye. Stoic didn't say anything for a moment, then glanced around at the flying dragons out in the open ceiling. He couldn't see any other houses, but then again it was clear that Valka hadn't been living as a Viking for many years. He shouldn't have expected to see another house, but he had hoped. "Where do you sleep?" he asked gruffly. "Gods forbid she live in a nest or den." Valka paused again in her pointless cleaning. "I curl up in Cloud Jumper's wings. It's most practical for safety and warmth, plus I don't have to carry bedding when we travel," she rambled, as if to make the blow a little less painful for Stoic. "It's kept me safe and alive during some hard winters outside the nest," she offered when she saw his expression turn dark. Stoic breathed deeply to control his frustration. It was worse than a nest or a den. This dragon had kidnapped his wife, befriended or bewitched her, and was still keeping them apart after reunion. She spent all her time with him, even night time. His fists tightened as he spat out the next question and hiccup. Valka picked up the fur and kept her eyes on him, her feet shifted to a position of action. With Toothless. They are seldom apart like Cloudjumper and myself, she answered bluntly, challenging him to deny her pride in her way of life. Her eyes were stormy as she stared him down. Stoic felt his anger boil, so hot he forgot how to talk. If he had his axe he would have cut off a scaly head. His son would prefer the company of a dragon to any person, and would not stay under the same roof for favor of his dragon, who could provide everything a person wanted: protection, love, food, companionship, and now even a place to sleep. Stoic wasn't needed in his own family. Valka turned away with her head held high, and stepped up to the edge of the cliff and clapped her hands twice while roaring over the edge of the sea stacks. 2 dragons roared back from the flock of scaly beasts circling the ceiling. With the sound of approaching wings, 2 nadders appeared over the edge of the cliff and perched. One threw up a little dirt as it landed. Stoic drew back and put up fists, but it was not needed. One was mostly yellowish-brownish green and had bright yellow eyes. The second was bigger and had a scar along its nose and a dent in its nose spike. It was purple, brown and green. After folding their wings they lumbered over, ogling the 2 humans with their one-eyed stare out of one half of their face, like birds. They chattered and squawked like oversized chickens too. They circled Valka, one on each side, constantly making noises and jerking their wings and tail spines. It looked either like they were sizing her up, or greeting her. Stoic was about to go defend her, when Valka surprised him once again and turned her head 90 degrees and chirping back at them. The nadders calmed down and settled their tails and wings to listen to her. Stoic lowered his fists and blinked repeatedly. What was she doing? Valka squawked and held up the furs. The 2-legged dragons inspected them with their snouts and shook their heads while snorting to clear their noses of the stink. Valka laughed. It was just like her old one, with a slight deep rumble mixed through, communicating to the dragons with every expression. Stoic was wondering if they had a language, because Valka did appear to be asking them something. She crouched and patted the furs, then waved a hand dramatically in an arch, hovering at the peak, while making several multi-pitched hums and chatters. The nadders squawked in reply and jumped onto the furs, gripping them in their claws, and took off into the sky as fast as they could, letting the furs air beneath them. Valka roared after them before turning to Stoic, looking pleased. They will be back in a while, then the furs will be good to use. She picked up her staff and walked a small way back down the path she had led him up. She paused a few feet away. Would you like to rest here for a moment? Or would you like to come with me? She asked. I will be going to the Thunderdrums. They will be soon leaving for their annual mating season. Their aggressiveness needs to be contained while in the company of others, she tutted to herself. Stoic considered it briefly. I need time to think, he admitted. Valka looked understanding, and a little sad. Of course Stoic, take as much time as you need. I will be looking for Hiccup and Toothless. Gods knows what mischief those 2 rascals have gotten into. She chuckled and disappeared down the overgrown path. Just another testament to her time in the dragon's element. The land was getting untouched as she spent more time on the wing. Stoic sat down heavily and put his head in his hands. It seemed that dragons had taken his place as provider for his wife. Everything he could give her: food, shelter, company. She had better with dragons. She wouldn't stay under the same roof as him. She would stay with the 4-winged beast who kidnapped her, as she had been doing for 20 years. However, maybe it was practical to be separate for a while, to get used to the idea of each other together once again. It was only a few hours ago that they had been reunited after all. But she had to be with dragons, bloody creatures. If she was alone then he would be glad. Hiccup was the same. Though it was worse with him. Stoic doubted that he would stay within talking distance for long without a scaly companion. The species intruded everywhere. He could not be in their lives without one interfering or outshining him, pulling them apart and away. How could they be a family if they could not even stay together as a family? Valka retreated to dragons when she upset him, unintentionally. Hiccup had retreated with dragons to get away from him, to be assured that his choices were right, and to interact with. He didn't want Stoic. He looked up to dragons, he listened and obeyed them. With Stoic all he wanted was to be away. In a destroyed reality, Wives and husbands would work past difficulties and explain them until they understood each other, though on Burke Valka was the only wife that complex, but that was why he loved her so different and challenging and bold despite her clumsiness and lack of physical strength. In reality, outside of dragons, sons would strive for their father's attentions and seek father's reassurance and father's interactions. Stoic didn't know what to do in this messed up world he now had chosen to live in. Could he do anything? He had to believe that somehow he could civilize his wife and child again. Once they had a promising future in his tribe, they could still have that. With their vast knowledge of dragons, their contributions could save so many lives and end the war for good. However, they were both too stubborn to offer anything about their scaly captors, and so far Valka had only shown him facts that he couldn't use for fighting, like disabled dragons and their unified behavior. He doubted he'd be able to get rid of the alpha dragon. It was colossal. It left him with nearly no hope of reintroducing his family back to Burke. With his head in his hands he sighed. What was he to do? A light click of claws made him aware of his surroundings again. Stoic looked up. The sound had come from above him, and saw Hiccup clinging with one gloved hand to the side of a cliff. Hiccup had one gloved hand deeply gouged into the rock crevices to beat gravity and support his hanging weight. His feet were perched on another indent, with one flat against the rock to stabilize himself. Stoic wondered how long he had been lingering there. His eyes were vivid and intense, his hair ruffled in the wind, and his expression was one of a learning observer. He leaned out from above a row of ferns, and the rock's shadows made his position highly sneaky. He appeared alone, but a quick glance around revealed the shadowing guardian. The Night Fury was above him on a higher sea stack, lounging with the appearance of casual interest, but his eyes betraying his intense focus on his human rider, and on the potential threat. Hiccup had his mask off so Stoic could see his curious and calculating expression very clearly. His forest green eyes were looking right at him and right through him. It was eerily similar to the alpha dragon's look. He may have well learned this method of seeing from the ground high creature. Stoic didn't dare move. He stayed sitting and twisting in place to keep his son's eyes. He didn't look away out of fear Hiccup would move away. Once again he was taking in as much as he could about his boy. The shape of his frame, the build he had around his shoulders, the strength in his core muscles to balance so expertly, and his bravery for climbing down a sheer drop to observe him. No doubt his boy was very stealthy. After a minute of silent watching, Hiccup spoke. He tilted his head and hummed questioningly, hopeless. Stoic blinked a few times. Hiccup's flat and drawled Norse, similar to the mispronunciations of those who spoke it as a second tongue, was understandable, but the meaning of his single-word sentence was not. He stood to face Hiccup fully. Twisting on that rock was making his neck stiff. Hiccup didn't tense or move, but the Night Fury's ears perked and his eyes narrowed at the chief's movement. Stoic ignored the most dangerous dragon as best he could while he faced the young man. "What did ye say?" he asked as non-threateningly as possible, treating Hiccup like a colt or bird that could easily be startled away. Hiccup rolled his eyes and snorted lightly. The Night Fury made a dragonish laughing noise before resuming his relaxed, yet poised guarding. Hiccup sniggered again, covering his mouth with his hand as he did so. He looked at his dragon and grinned. Stoic got the feeling he was being called stupid, or something along those lines. Insulted by a dragon. Hiccup finished grinning at his dragon and turned back to Stoic. He covered his face with a hand and hunched his shoulders, mimicking Stoic's defeated position from earlier. Hiccup then faced Stoic again with his hand lowered, hopeless. "You feel hopeless, why?" he asked, tilting his head once again, nearly at 90 degrees. Stoic was surprised at the question. Hiccup had cut through all his layers and saw clearly the emotion caused by the turmoil, but could not understand the turmoil itself. That was probably the only reason for this conversation. It was an intelligent question and deep understanding of emotions. More than Stoic expected from a feral youth. Hiccup was still tilting his head, but his eyes were starting to narrow in impatience, or maybe he was guessing what Stoic was thinking and disapproved. Stoic began to form an answer as best he could. He grunted slightly. "I have been replaced by dragons, and I want to be the husband for my wife and the father for my son, but apparently dragons do my job better." He glanced sadly after Valka and sighed. Hiccup made a low noise of sadness. "Lost family," he interpreted. Stoic nodded. "When that I mean, Your mother's dragon took you and your mother away a long time ago. I lost my family, and my chance at a happy family in my home. I was wondering how to get it back. Hiccup looked uncomfortable. Viking family, he muttered with an edgy shift in his body and a shudder as unpleasant thoughts crossed his mind. Probably along the lines of being raised to kill those dragons he held dear in this life. Hiccup looked at Stoic again and tilted his head again. Hopeless because you have no Viking family, he clarified. Stoic shrugged something like that. He wouldn't dare voice his true opinion aloud. Hiccup would never speak to him again if he did that. Hiccup hissed at that answer and lightly hit the rock he clung to out of frustration. He snarled angrily a few times with his dragon listening. The Night Fury sat up and cooed down at him, making Hiccup breathe deeply and calm down. Then the dragon trilled in his throat and gestured to Stoic with a nod of his head. Hiccup sighed, forced to do something he didn't like once again. He met Stoic's eyes. I don't understand, he admitted with a frustrated expression, not happy with his lack of understanding, but even less with admitting it. Stoic cleared his throat and tried to explain. He was trying to get through to Hiccup and he didn't want Hiccup attacking him out of anger. He had to have a dragon's temper. It wouldn't matter to me if you and Valka were Vikings, pirates, wanderers or dragon tamers. I would just want you near me, so we could be a family. I thought that now I had found you that we could be a family again, but I don't fit in with you and your mother now. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. He was not good at expressing himself, but he was making a big effort in an attempt to have Hiccup closer to him. I can't see how to make us a family, he admitted. Hiccup's face lost his frustration and filled with sympathy as Stoic explained. Hopeless, because you do not know how to solve a problem, and feel lost on how to find what you lost, he summarized, filling in the meaning behind the emotion. You do not know how to reconnect with your mate. He glanced over the sanctuary to where his mother was prowling around. Stoic nodded, feeling heavy. Or my son. Hiccup looked thoughtful and was quiet for a while. The light wind caused by many dragons forcing air through the sanctuary lightly messed his auburn brown hair. He was leaning out over some clinging wall plants, so if he hadn't called Stoic's attention he would have never spotted him. Maybe he had been there all along, spying. Hiccup looked out over the haven for a short while, admiring or thinking, then met Stoic's eyes again. To reconnect he began, surprising Stoic by offering a solution in the first place. You must start looking at us. He gestured in the direction of his dragon and his mother to make Stoic understand who was included in us. And note what you see: toothless, dragon. Hiccup, dragon child, not Viking, strange. Cloudjumper, dragon, mate stealer, family stealer. Valka, mate, dragon lady, dragon protector, not Viking, strange. Hiccup placed a hand on his eyes then his head. Then you must slowly stop seeing mum as mate, dragon lady, dragon protector, not Viking, strange. Accept that all these names and parts are Valka, then you can reconnect with your mate. Because when you see her, you will see all of her, and you will know her and how to be with her, he explained. He looked up and pure untroubled joy and friendship lit up his face as he looked at his dragon. The look was mirrored in the dragon's eyes, which were soft, round and warm towards his tiny friend. It was clear they knew each other so deeply. No creature could show such openness towards another and not mean it with every fiber of their being. It was strange for Stoic to see a dragon looking at another creature with such unconditional love and happiness. It was what was absent from his and Valka's relationship. Stoic drew in a steady, deep breath. Hiccup had given him advice. To stop seeing Valka as all these different things and to reconnect with her by understanding her and accepting her changes and choices. Only when he saw Valka in her entirety, dragon parts and people parts, would he be able to stay with and love the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. It seemed that was exactly the case. It was foolish of him to expect things to resume as if she had never left. They had both changed so much and yet so little, and the world had changed. Hiccup was wise to show him the way forwards. He was more intelligent than Stoic was expecting. He had so much to learn about him. His advice was so simple, and yet so hard. He had to accept all parts of her. Even her scaly friends. But it was true that it was the only way. He looked at Hiccup and nodded when the boy had finished his silent exchange with his dragon. Hiccup's face held a bit of satisfaction as Stoic accepted the hard road before him. But he held Stoic's gaze firmly. You must also do the same with dragons. Stop seeing dragons, and start seeing people, as Mum and I and your Vikings are, he added, glaring as if to back up this extra requirement. The flex of his clawed hands showed that he would not accept a refusal. Stoic grunted at this extra request. He had to accept dragons. He should have seen this coming, because Hiccup and Valka were so tightly interwoven with these creatures now that it made regrettable sense that they were a packaged deal. If he cut one part out, he would cut them out too. He would lose them forever. His eyes shifted to the scaly-backed dragon who was shadowing his son from above. It was lying on its paws, angled towards the exchange with its narrow wedge head subtly flicking between them as each spoke, listening as if it could understand, which it obviously couldn't. It was only an animal, and the bane of his existence. Stoic met its eyes and the Night Fury closed off all emotion to regard him with curiosity, trying to read him while giving nothing away. A sign of mistrust and defense, but nothing aggressive. Try as Stoic might, as if it would be that easy, he could not see a heart and soul in that black mass. He could not see a friend or companion in the dragon, a pet maybe, but there was too much in the past and too much that was strange and beastly for Stoic to see a person in this dragon. He faced his son again, who was watching with an expectant look, one that Stoic recognized as waiting for a result and expecting him to fail. It was daring him to say I won't or I can't, and yet held a slight spark of hope for improvement. Stoic glanced between them again and spoke softly. That may take some time, he admitted, praying that a neutral answer would be enough. Hiccup sighed, his face patient as he nodded, not looking angry surprisingly. He seemed to understand that changing people wasn't an instant process. The Night Fury growled a little from above when Hiccup began to turn away. Hiccup paled a little before looking at his feet like a scolded child. He looked ashamed and yet puffed out his chest in pride while turning back to Stoic. The Alpha told me to see you the same way. Proud for his Alpha, ashamed of his reluctance. Stoic looked at him interested, and a little excited. Could he? Hiccup rolled his shoulders uncomfortably, as if he was shifting a heavy weight around. I must stop seeing Stoic, Viking Alpha, Dragon Killer, Stranger in the Nest, Guest, he who doesn't understand, and more. I must slowly understand and see you as person. He returned the burden, showing that Stoic's struggle was matched by Hiccup's, in every way. And then as Stoic. They met each other's eyes again and Stoic nodded, accepting the compromise, challenge and solution set before him. Both had so much to learn and accept and understand, and they were willing to give as much as the other did. Hiccup relaxed a little at the acknowledgement and silently declared this conversation over by twisting till he was gripping the rocks with both clawed gloves. He climbed back up the cliff silently, with only small grunts of exertion as he heaved himself up the stone with his clawed gloves the only grip. He chirped slightly at his dragon once he neared the top and the Night Fury stood up and lowered his tail so Hiccup could grip it and be pulled up the last meter. Hiccup was dragged over the cliff and rolled to his crouching position, humming and chirping animatedly as a sign of happiness, while he puffed his chest out in success. The Night Fury cooed and stepped closer to nuzzle Hiccup in reply. Hiccup closed his eyes and leaned into the dragon's touches like a cat into a scratching hand. The absolute peace and happiness on his face when the dragon touched him was freakish, like a man sighing in relief whilst plunging their hand into a naked flame. The Night Fury opened his eyes and revealed large round eyes full of trust, love, contentment and peace while looking at Hiccup, who was resting his forehead against the dragon's. Hiccup trilled happily along with the Night Fury, who began to playfully butt him with his nose, knocking him on his side so he could pretend to attack Hiccup's belly and underarms. Hiccup retaliated with light pets and scratches to the dragon's jaw, which the dragon dodged and ducked around with the attitude of a child avoiding tickling fingers. Both yelped and laughed and growled amidst their brotherly game, with all the playfulness of pouncing kittens. Stoic realized they had forgotten about him already. They were so engrossed in their bond that anything outside their concerns was gone when they were together. They were each the center of their worlds. It was so unnatural. But he had to interrupt and ask something important. Something that would give him hope in his hopelessness. Stoic interrupted the pair's gentle playing by asking, will you one day see me as father? Hiccup and the Night Fury jumped slightly, surprised by his booming voice, and looked at him silently. Hiccup tilted his head as he sat up and considered the question seriously, once again examining Stoic as the Alpha had done, with his eyes into Stoic's most hidden layers. Stoic had to repress the urge to flinch. He had never been so critically examined by another person. Hiccup didn't move, all his energy and attention were in his eyes. Plus he wasn't sure what a human raised by dragons would be looking for. That made him nervous on top of his worries for the answer. Should he hide his reactions for show them? The Night Fury stayed hovering, but merely glanced between them without distracting them. Stoic held his son's gaze with his heart in his throat. The Night Fury was still as he let the scene play out, and for this single moment all other dragons appeared to be still and far away. All of Stoic's world rested on this boy and his answer to a lifeline question. Hiccup eventually looked away and mumbled something. The dragon warbled softly and shifted his front paws restlessly. Hiccup smiled as he met his dragon's eyes. He stood from his crouch and swung himself onto the Night Fury's back, the Night Fury ducking to make sure Hiccup got on faster. Stoic thought he wasn't going to answer, but he looked down at Stoic and flashed a crooked smile that may take some time. He returned with his signature drawl, a drawl that made everything he said sound sarcastic, but his eyes showed only sincerity. Stoic fought the urge to respond to that smile and answer. His eyes crinkled a little at the wit his son was firing back at him. He relaxed, now feeling like there was the beginning of a bridge over a river, or the beginnings of a path on uncharted land. Hiccup's smile widened slightly, then he looked up into the air and patted his friend's neck. The Night Fury huffed and pointed its head in a direction of interest before looking up at its rider for his response. Hiccup got into flying position and grinned widely. They howled and roared briefly before the Night Fury dove off the cliff and swooped over the sanctuary and over the water of the indoor pools, leaving white trailing streaks over the water as they flew. Stoic sighed at the dramatic escape. Just like your mother. She always had to have a dramatic flair. Underscore 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 underscore. When night fell, the air was alive with the beating of wings and dragons calling for their hatchlings to come back to the nest for sleep. Stoic had been exploring the section around his guest house. He was really considering sending a message to his men. He didn't want to have a power struggle upon his return, for he was going to return after Valka proved her point, or when he had had enough. The area around his cave house was limited. There was the overgrown path that led down to the sea stacks by the white giant and then, past him, to all other corners of the nest accessible by foot. There was a rough ring of flat ground around the cave, and some old rotten fence about child height at the edges of the cliff. There was a bath of sorts at the back of the cave which was constantly being filled with melted ice and constantly draining through several drilled holes. It was a better option of bathing than going down to the sea and have dragons staring at you, Stoic acknowledged. Finally there was an entry to a tunnel around the left side of the cave outside ring. It went in deep and twisted and turned and split in many different directions, including up and down. It was the network of the mountain that was included in the ice fortress. By the claw marks they were still used, but not by all different species, but by night furies, terrible terrors, and gronkles. Stoic even spotted human footprints. Valka and Hiccup could navigate these caves too. It was more likely to be Hiccup since the four-winged beast couldn't fit in these tunnels, and Valka didn't ever seem far from his massive form. Stoic had just decided to head out and find Valka in order to write a message, or to ask her to let him appear in person, to his men to explain what had happened when all dragons suddenly took to their air inside and poured in through tunnels from the outside. The nest had been getting dim for some time now, which was the reason Stoic hadn't explored further, since it was obviously getting close to night and he needed to stay near his safe zone. But suddenly there was a huge increase of dragons pouring into the nest, like rivers of scales. Stoic stood and moved to grab his non-existent axe, only to remember Hiccup had handed it over to a terrible terror this morning and hadn't returned it. But old instincts died hard, and seeing this many dragons flying reminded him of the raids on Burke, and stirred his need to fight. But the dragons didn't seem to be threatening or getting ready to fight. Some of them were herding their dragon babies back to their nests, others were reuniting with others of their kind, and all of them were finding places to settle and rest. Stoic watched a pair of monstrous nightmares, both a greenish-brown in color, circle above him together, their heads brushing every now and then in affectionate gestures, and eventually they settled in a wide but low cave. He couldn't see them from then on. Several pairs of wings sounded very close to him and he turned to see Valka, Hiccup and their dragons land behind him. Hiccup looked uneasy, he called to his mother and hunched his shoulders in a scared gesture. Valka cooed at him gently and chirped and trilled reassurance to her clearly anxious son. Hiccup didn't look convinced by what she was saying. Stoic looked confused. Hiccup saw his expression and muttered curfew. The Night Fury looked annoyed and worried too, it warbled at its rider and Hiccup leaned down to wrap his arms around the dragon's head. They both glanced behind them and saw the king dragon leaving the nest via its deep water tunnels. Stoic wondered where it was going, and why its subjects were being left behind. Valka looked up at what Stoic had been watching in the sky, she smiled as she slid from the four-winged beast's back. Her eyes were alight with joy as she approached. That was Fireclaw and Spikesnout, she said, pointing. They've been a mated pair for over 5 years. They are never apart because Fireclaw is expecting a clutch of eggs soon. She spoke of the dragons like a housewife would a newly married or expecting couple on Berk. Stoic had heard the women gossip and laugh and fawn over bubbling romances or pregnant mothers. It was surreal to hear Valka direct that talk at a large scaly reptile. Hiccup was smiling too, his attention diverted. He hooted and patted the Night Fury's head, since he hadn't dismounted, and they flew up to the cave where the happy couple were staying the night. Stoic flinched a little at the speed of the Night Fury's takeoff, but soon recovered and stepped back to see where the pair had gone. They have names, he commented, surprised that dragons would have them. That implied language and a knowledge of yourself that a dumb beast did not have. Though it was far more likely Valka's idea to name them to tell them apart. Valka nodded yes. She absently shifted her grip on her staff. Stoic looked at her. Why'd you call them that, he asked. Valka rolled her eyes. I didn't, she corrected. They are given names when they hatch. The mother will care for them for a week, and when it's clear that they will survive she will give them a name. I think they watch their personalities and distinctive features and incorporate them into their name. Stoic blinked. They have language, he asked, disbelieving. Valka sent him an indignant look. They aren't stupid, Stoic. She looked back up at the den they had settled into. The Night Fury's tail was sticking out one end, and twitching animatedly. Valka's eyes and voice were distant. They were refugees from Berk's attacking dragons. Cloudjumper and myself convinced Fireclaw and Spikesnout to come with us as a raid was ending. They were very lucky. It's rare that mated pairs are allowed to leave her nest together. It's a cruel manipulation of their loyal bond, for they can never abandon each other. She sounded angry and sad, but mostly disgusted. Stoic was about to question that when she cut him off with a question of her own. Do you want to see them, she asked, gesturing to her four-winged beast. Stoic was about to say no, but his wife's hopeful face was too much to let down. He looked reluctant as he nodded fine. Valka's smile was worth it. It lit her up from the inside out and her entire body gained a lighter step as she grabbed his arm, once again in her claycloth shell armor, and took him over to her dragon's side. It was at that point that Stoic realized he'd have to fly on the dragon who put them all in this mess. He stopped. Valka wasn't strong enough to keep him moving, so jerked as he stopped and she tried to keep walking. She was still clutching his hand tightly. Valka looked back at Stoic, and Stoic thought that she looked so far away even though she was touching him. The sadness and distance between them left her out of reach. Stoic cleared his throat awkwardly and glanced at the curious four-winged beast. Somehow his glance turned into a glare. The four-winged beast's head crests fluttered slightly, and a low rumble sounded from its deep-fronted chest. It sounded calm, and like it was quietly breaking the news to its rider. It did not sound angry, but it sounded gentle. At Valka's crestfallen face it mirrored her sadness and would have probably moved to comfort her if Stoic hadn't have been glaring so angrily at it. Valka glanced between them again and let out a quiet "oh." She let his hand go and faced him with both hands on her staff. It was almost like she was using it as a crutch in the ground. It is the only way up into the cave. I could ask another dragon to help you if you would prefer. Stoic shook his head. I'll climb, he stubbornly stated, and turned to the cliff face. He would not stoop as low to ride the dragon who had destroyed his world. Underscore 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 underscore. Valka sighed in disappointment and moved to her companion. She let out a soft whimper that was nearly a sob, and let her shoulders sag while mumbling soft hoots and whines to her giant friend. I am burdened, my task has brought only sadness and disappointment. Cloudjumper lowered his head to her eye level and exhaled warm air onto her while humming deeply. I am here, sister mine, be comforted. Your task is dawning, you cannot build a nest in a day. He lifted his wings slightly and purred again. Lighten your wings, Valka. She met his large golden eyes and placed a hand on his peculiar nose. Brother mine, thank you. Valka smiled and nuzzled his forehead. I love you, brother mine. Cloudjumper nuzzled her forehead back. I love you, sister mine. Valka straightened up and scaled his wings to her normal spot on the back of his neck. They knew each other so well that her faithful companion could tell she was braced and ready, and began to ascend to the den of the monstrous nightmare pair. Cloudjumper was careful to not beat his wings too hard or too close to his sister's mate. He did not wish for her long-lost mate to fall. He harbored no ill will towards the Viking. If the alpha had accepted him, then he had no reason to stir up the water. Cloudjumper gripped the edges of the den to let his sister climb inside. He was too large to fit inside. Toothless the smaller dragon could not sit upright in this place. He had to remain on all fours. Hiccup could not stand fully upright in this den either, but he was comfortable crouching. It was perfect for sleeping nightmares, who were flatter creatures. Valka slid into the den and approached on all fours to her son's side. She cooed slightly and he turned and smiled at her, humming back. Son. Mother. Hiccup was sitting by Fireclaw's head and scooted to one side for Valka to be included in the conversation. He trilled a little and ranged his claws across the ground while exhaling slowly. Fireclaw will lay when the earth is frozen, he told her excitedly. He smiled widely and expressed his joy in several wordless noises. Valka gasped and moved closer, also chattering in happiness. She placed a hand on her snout, with her permission, and moved her head to look her body up and down while trilling inquisitively. Happy? Fireclaw, are you healthy? Fireclaw breathed out steadily and moved her head to nuzzle her belly, basking in the extra warmth the eggs caused inside her. I am content, my hatchling's fires are strong. She turned back to Valka and Hiccup and hummed at many different notes. Yes, Valka, Hiccup, I am healthy. Toothless gently butted in and gurgled slightly as he bounced. He glanced at her belly and put his head on his paws with his eyes large and round. Excited. Permission to touch. Fireclaw's eyes rounded and she nuzzled the younger dragon, gently nudging him towards her belly. Permission, go ahead. Her mate raised his head to watch the young Night Fury and his brother approach her belly. The human pressed the side of his head to her stomach and at once closed his eyes with a smile lighting up his face. He cooed. Amazement. He pulled away very slightly to look at the mated pair. He rumbled and his smile grew. They are so warm. Toothless sniffed while his brother felt and he cooed as well, trilling with large eyes and a proud expression. Hot fires for strong hatchlings. Be proud parents. The pair of monstrous nightmares nuzzled each other and hummed, not saying anything but happy and love over and over again to each other, without even realizing it. They did not just speak with noises, their bodies made up the majority of their conversations. Voices were good for specific words and expressions but mostly emotions were vocal. Cloudjumper's eyes were warm too. Family. He summed up all their feeling of pride, joy, worry, health, warmth and eggs in one word. Everyone in the den looked to him and, in their own ways, expressed their happy agreement. Hiccup and Toothless exchanged glances and nodded enthusiastically. Valka cooed and placed a hand to her heart. The mated pair curled around each other tighter. Spike's snout extended a winged arm over his mate and settled his head next to her. She was the longer of the two, with a beautiful tail and long neck, with her signature long claws, that were the first things she set on fire, to support her form. But Spike's snout had the larger wings. They made him a formidable hunter and a perfect protector as he could cover his mate easily and comfortably. Cloudjumper's crests fluttered when he became aware of approaching grunts. He looked down outside the den and saw his sister's mate climbing up. He tilted his head and sighed to himself. Prideful sister's mate, you would rather struggle alone than accept help because I am a dragon. Foolish, he concluded. However, Cloudjumper was neither prideful nor foolish, so softly alerted his sister to her mate's slow, struggling approach. underscore 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 underscore. Stoic climbed slowly up the cliffside. He regretted his choice a little since it was harder than Hiccup made it look. The rock had little handholds and often crumbled due to plant growth among the cracks. But he was stubborn and would not give in to accepting a dragon's help. When he was about 2 meters away from the den, his wife's dragon let out a soft roar into the den, that blasted four-winged beast clinging onto the side of the rocks like a bat with his hooked underwings and his larger clawed feet. Moments later Valka appeared over the side of the cliff, on all fours and staff in her hand and resting across her shoulders. The dragon had altered her to his approach. She smiled a little. That was quick. She acknowledged and lowered her staff a little for him to grab hold of. Need a hand, she asked. Stoic grunted. I've got it. He hauled himself up the last meter and gripped the cliff edge. Valka put her hand on his and pulled, helping him over the lip of the cliff. Stoic sighed, glad that the ordeal was over, but shook his head fondly at his wife. I said I had it, he reminded her. Valka snorted, prideful. Hiccup, the Night Fury, and the four-winged beast all let out chortles. Hiccup even rolled onto his back with his hands on his tummy. Stoic glanced between them, confused. Obviously one word had held many meanings for this much response. What? He asked. Valka shook her head slightly. It doesn't matter, Stoic, I was merely making a remark. They just agree with me. She rested a hand on his arm lightly as she chuckled, and then crawled forwards towards the dozing nightmares. Come see, you made it all the way up here after all. She beckoned several times. Stoic awkwardly shuffled forwards. He didn't have the thin, lean and flexible frames of his wife and child, so his bulk and bigness was a handicap at the moment. Hiccup gave him a highly confused and freaked out look before ducking under the Night Fury's wing and tucking himself into the dragon's side. He kept his head out but stayed close to the flank of his scaly friend. The said scaly monster was watching with silent eyes, though it occasionally looked down at Hiccup, as if it was checking on him. Stoic forced himself to look past his son and to his wife, who was in deep communication with the pair of alert and wary nightmare dragons. Valka was gesturing calmly with her hands, while clicking and humming with her voice. The larger, the male Stoic thought, growled and covered his nest partner even more, a trickle of smoke leaking from his mouth. Hiccup and the Night Fury growled back. The Night Fury raised his head and barked once, trailing into a growl, and stretched his wings out briefly before rumbling and nudging Hiccup. The male shook his head with a snort but rested his head on the ground and grunted just the once. His mate nudged his head gently, her eyes round and calm. She nudged Valka's hand until it was pressed to her snout, then she turned and nuzzled her flank. Valka smiled and the Night Fury and Hiccup relaxed. Stoic realized that he may have been in danger, but his wife and the Night Fury had negotiated against such a human activity amongst beasts, so unholy. His safety. The female seemed to trust his wife. It seemed to have been down to her decision. Stoic didn't know why the male was so mistrustful. He was unarmed, and he was outnumbered. What did he have to worry about? However, he grudgingly recalled being overprotective of Valka in her carrying months. They were not that different. He would not let a stranger from another tribe near his pregnant wife without reservations either. Stoic at once hated that he was sympathizing with a dragon. He groaned inside his own head. Valka put down her staff and beckoned Stoic to the side of the nightmare female. Come, she ordered. Stoic awkwardly joined her. He heard Hiccup snort a few times and the Night Fury gurgle as if they were laughing. They probably found humor in his lumbering ways. Stoic resisted the urge to turn and glare at them as he would to any of the village children. It would not have helped in any way and would probably have been read as aggressive. But the sniggering was distracting, and wasn't helping Stoic's aim of becoming someone to look up to for Hiccup, since he was clearly seeing something to scorn. Valka took his hand and hushed the nightmare gently before putting her hand on her flank. Firewing says she will lay when the ground is frozen, a perfect time for nightmares. She can keep them warm in the coldest months, and when they hatch in the spring they won't be hurried into finding their fire, she absently said. She caught his eyes and nodded insistently at the beast's belly. Go on, touch her, she has allowed it, Valka ordered. Stoic glanced at the watching heads and glared when the male hissed at him. Valka turned and snarled back, surprising Stoic enormously. She turned back to Stoic and added, "You're not helping." Stoic jumped and looked down, sighing deeply. I'm sorry Valka, but there's a fire-breathing monster that looks like it's going to eat me, and... Valka cut him off with a sharply raised hand, unwilling to hear out his was vs them rants. Spike's snout will not harm you if you do not harm his mate. Here she picked up his hand again and placed it where she had just touched. Stoic was surprised at how warm the Smolder-class dragon was. The scales were fine, the size of his thumbnail, and smooth with a slight oily feel to them. He pulled away once Valka let him go, then hesitantly touched the dragon again. He glanced at the female, who was watching with intense eyes but with a relaxed body. Stoic looked at the flank again and tried to recall if any other monstrous nightmares had felt this warm when he had touched them. Granted, he had mostly touched their dead bodies after slaying them, but even those fresh dead and freshly on fire had not felt this warm. It wasn't uncomfortably hot, but it definitely felt like a running fever temperature. He pulled away and rubbed his hand absently on his clothes. Are all dragons that hot? He asked. Valka hummed a small laugh and ran a hand down the nightmare's neck. No. Fireclaw has to maintain a hot temperature for her eggs to form properly and hatch healthy babies. She seemed to launch into teacher mode after that. Any questions Stoic asked were answered with much information to show off what she had learned or to share it. She sat comfortably and said Fireclaw is a Smolder-class dragon and as such their inner heat is crucial to their health. The nightmares carry their eggs for the longest time before laying because they lock heat inside the eggs as they are forming inside them. The babies need heat to survive or they will be stillborn, or coldborn as I like to call it. She drew in the earth in between them. Once she lays the eggs she will maintain their heat every now and then by setting herself on fire and curling around them. Spike's snout will help in this task too. She glanced behind her and smiled at the dozing pair. They had relaxed around the stranger, as long as Valka was there. Hotter fires mean stronger babies. Stoic listened, unwillingly interested. He had never thought about their breeding habits before, or even how they were born. They could have crawled out of a volcano for all he knew or cared, but this made the dragons less mystical and more natural. Valka resumed her small lesson. Each egg and baby is unique, so their personal hatching time is also unique. But when they are ready they will set themselves on fire inside their eggs and burn their ways out. The eggs will smoke and burn away, leaving a baby who had just felt his or her first flame and who is ready to face the world. The hotter the air outside the more chance all will survive, which is why it is dangerous for eggs to be laid in the autumn because that puts hatching time around midwinter and increases their chances of being coldborn. Stoic had a hand rubbing his chin as he learned. How many eggs per nightmare? He asked. Valka shrugged. It ranges from about 3 to 9, depending on size, internal heat, health and other things. She picked up her staff again and looked outside where a few dragons were still flying around. A first-time mother dragon should only be expecting about 3 or 4. I believe it is in their biology to have fewer babies first to get enough practice for any bigger clutches later in life. She turned to Hiccup and clicked her tongue and jerked her head in the direction of the still active dragons. Hiccup snapped to his mother's direction of interest and tilted his head, humming in confusion before tapping his dragon's wing and the pair moving to the entrance of the den. Hiccup slid onto his dragon's back and they flew towards the flying dragons. Stoic looked at Valka. Where's he going? Valka waved his concern aside. I told him to check on them. It's nothing. You must be tired. It's time to sleep, she informed him with a soft smile. They made their ways to the edge of the den and Valka swung herself onto the back of her four-winged beast. She held out a hand to Stoic. You'll never get down in the dark, Stoic. Don't be too proud this time, she warned. Stoic looked down at the cliffside. He had climbed up with a twilight sort of light, and the den had been lit by the fires of the dragons, but now it was nearly fully dark. He could see nothing of the cliff as it was out of reach of the flames behind him. He sighed, knowing that if he tried he would fall to his death. He held out a hand, but glared heatedly at the dragon he was boarding. Only because my wife insists, he growled at the beast. To the beast's credit, it did not even roll its eyes in response. It only spread its largest wings and glided down in seconds to the cave home where Stoic would be living for his time here. Stoic jumped off the moment he could, grunting when he landed on an unseen rock. He hissed as he stepped forwards on his foot. Valka huffed and slid down the dragon's wing harmlessly. That wouldn't have happened if you had been sensible, she scolded, and moved to the house. Valka sat down by the fireplace and knocked 2 rocks together to start a fire. Strange that she would do that with fire-breathing dragons all around the place, but Stoic supposed she was trying to make an effort to be approachable. Stoic moved to the table and sat awkwardly as his wife walked and stumbled around the small house, getting it ready for him to sleep in. She then gathered 2 cups of water and placed them at the table where he was sitting. She took the opposite seat and looked down silently at the cup in her hands. Stoic grunted in thanks before taking a long draught of his water, for it was only water, then copied Valka's action of watching the ripples silently. The silence was only broken by the whispering flickers of flame and the occasional crack of sparks out of the wood. Stoic honestly didn't know what to say, he could barely make eye contact. They were alone for the first time, and when he didn't have a scaly beast around them to focus their attentions on, it was obviously clear that they didn't have anything to say to each other. Valka broke the firelight silence first. "How are the people of Berk?" she asked. Stoic cleared his throat slightly. "Good. We just finished another failed voyage to destroy the dragon's nest, but," well, he trailed off. She knew the story because it was the same every time. Valka looked disapproving as ever when it came to talk of the war, but sipped her drink and changed the subject. "How is Gobber and your brother?" Stoic thought back to the last time she had seen either of them. "Gobber has lost a leg, a dragon bit it clean off." Valka flinched a little and paled slightly, but said nothing and didn't meet his eyes. Probably feeling the shame he felt talking about casualties of war, she supported the dragons so Gobber's hand was on their claws. Stoic continued, "He is still the town forger, he's just as capable. I dare say all the heat he works in has gone to his head over the years. He's also in charge of training the new recruits for defending the village." Valka smiled a little, remembering their old friend. He was the best man at their wedding, her confidant and partner in crime when Stoic was busy. He was a loyal friend. "Spitalut has a son." That caught her interest. "I have a nephew," she marveled to herself, still nursing her drink and keeping her eyes away from her husband. All her family was dead, her parents only had her, though she did have relatives in the wandering tribes over the islands through her mother's side. A new family member was probably interesting to her. "What's he like?" she asked softly. Stoic frowned a little. A Viking," he summed up, making Valka's interest turn into disappointment. "Looks like Spitalut a lot, called him Snotlout, he's Hiccup's age." He rambled a few facts together, but most Vikings on Berk were the same, and it was clear that she had lost interest if her face was anything to judge by. Valka nodded at each piece of information absently. Stoic wondered if she was really listening. "And dear old Gothai," she smiled fondly. Stoic chuckled. "She's still there, old girl's too stubborn for Valhalla. She oversaw Gobber's recovery, and has been watching the recruits for promise. So far she has been silent on the issue." In every way, he added, well aware of the pun he was making about their mute elder. Valka sighed to herself. "Poor things, locked in cages and made to fight for survival only to be slain at the end. There is no alternative allowed." Stoic shook his head. "Not at all, my dear. We've not had a recruit die for years. We take extreme precautions." Valka met his eyes and hers were sad. "I wasn't talking about the children, Stoic." Stoic lost his voice. Valka searched his eyes deeply, but sagged over her cup when she had concluded. "You don't even see what you're doing," she whispered. "They have no choice, and when you catch them they have no chance. It's too cruel." She stood up and wiped at her eyes slightly. She had been moved to tears by the suffering of the training dragons. Stoic was silent as she mourned for the trapped animals, knowing full well that the Viking teams were in little danger in the kill ring. Valka cleared her throat and poured the rest of the drink into her mouth before standing with ridged limbs. Stoic watched her as she turned to the exit. "I should go," she said. "Good night." Stoic leaned down and picked up her staff. Valka I. When she turned to him, all he wanted to say, that it was natural, that he was sorry, that he didn't see them that way, all died in his throat. She glanced over her shoulder at him, waiting for his response. Finally he spotted her staff and knelt to pick it up. He held her staff towards her and she took it silently. He met her lovely green eyes and leaned in to kiss her cheek goodnight. Valka's lips twitched in a smile as she turned away, her cheekbones a little pink. She nodded and left the cave, stepping back into her element. The tension ran out of her shoulders and her body shifted to stride and stalk confidently across the uneven natural earth. Stoic watched her from his cave and saw her approach her dragon. She raised a hand to it and it leaned down, its crests fluttering as it rumbled in greeting. She hooted and cooed, then stretched leisurely as she looked up into the near darkness of the nest ceiling. Her dragon looked up and hooted like an oversized horse owl into the quiet. Seconds later a shadow out of the night landed on the earth beside the grounded pair. So silent if Stoic hadn't been looking he would have never saw their descent. Hiccup slid from his Night Fury's back and crouched by its side, chattering to his mother softly. Valka smiled and crouched too as she approached him, lifting a hand to run through his windblown hair and smooth down one cheek. Hiccup leaned into her touch, trapping her hand between his chin and shoulder and closing his eyes. Valka's eyes glowed like embers, adoring and warm as she hummed and cupped his face in her hands. Stoic couldn't look away from the pair of them. Valka smiled at Hiccup, who smiled crookedly back. She placed a kiss on his forehead before the both nuzzled noses, then cheeks like cats. Stoic understood what they were saying to each other, "I love you," expressing their love as mother and son. It was so obvious that even a Viking would have been able to see it, and he could. Their bond was special and it made his heart hurt, but lighten, to see them so close. The Night Fury gently butted Hiccup's shoulder and looked at Valka with large eyes. Valka smiled and cupped the lizard's jaw before pressing a kiss to its forehead too, and the creature rubbed against her cheek as his rider had done. Valka grinned and pulled the two of them into a hug. Hiccup hugged her back with his arms. The Night Fury tucked its head behind her shoulder to hold her to his chest with his tail wrapping around Hiccup's back, and finally the four-winged creature extended his giant wings around them all. Stoic was speechless with the beautiful sight. It was a family, made of friends and a mother and son, and they all loved each other. Once the four-winged beast folded his wings again, Hiccup approached him and reached up for the beast's face. The larger dragon lowered his head to Hiccup's level and allowed the smaller being to rest his cheek to his own, Hiccup's arms also stretching fruitlessly to hold the larger dragon in a hug. The four-winged beast held endless patience with Hiccup as the hug lasted longer than expected, but he eventually breathed down his odd nose, washing warm air over Hiccup. Hiccup leaned back with a disgruntled noise, but mischief grew over his features and he promptly blew a raspberry in the larger dragon's face. The four-winged beast shook his great head and reared back in alarm while Hiccup laughed, fell backwards, and rolled backwards over his shoulder until he was nearer his Night Fury friend. He hooted mockingly and laughed some more when the larger dragon growled and gave the human an unimpressed look, that somehow never lost its deeply caring loving undertones. Valka gasped at her son's cheekiness and reached over with her long fingers to attack his vulnerable, thin ribs. Hiccup yelped and dissolved into laughter again when Valka kept up her remorseless tickling. He rolled this way and that, but she was just as nimble and kept him under her hands until he was red in the face. The Night Fury watched with a dopey face, head on his paws while the humans played. Hiccup let out several wails but the Night Fury just looked more amused, ignoring his cries for help in favor of watching. Valka eventually laid down beside her panting son, panting herself from laughter and showing all her white teeth as she smiled. Hiccup regained his breath and glared at her. He reached across and slapped her arm lightly in reprimand. He could probably never put any real force behind a hit towards her, and he was still smiling in the aftermath of play too. Valka ignored his jibe and hummed slightly, pointing at the ceiling. Hiccup sat up and followed her finger, his attention instantly captivated. He tilted his head and trilled softly, before turning to his dragon and chirping at him. The Night Fury rose to his feet and looked up also. He sniffed the air slightly and warbled with a nod of his head. His many ears fluttered softly with whatever had grabbed their attention. Hiccup looked back at the ceiling with excitement in his eyes, but quickly cracked a yawn. Valka sat up and nudged his shoulder with hers, urging him towards his dragon. She closed her eyes and rolled her shoulders with an accompanying groan. Hiccup sighed and nodded with a hum. He leaned forwards and pecked her cheek, surprising her, before the smaller pair bounded over to the cliffside. Valka was smiling in pleasure and held a hand to her cheek with her dragon looking proudly over them both. Stoic thought that human gestures of affection were probably rare, but special, in their world. Hiccup had no one to show him all of them, so he only returned what his mother had shown him whilst growing up. As Hiccup ran past the cave, on all fours with his Night Fury trotting by his side, he spotted Stoic watching him and tensed, jerking into a low crouch with his feet positioned to run or leap. The Night Fury stopped when he tensed, and quickly stretched a wing over his human friend, pulling him into his side and out of Stoic's sight. Stoic glared at the dragon. How dare he hide his son from him? But Hiccup poked his head back out again and seemed more confident with the scaly wing shielding him. He was pressing himself into the dragon's flank as they moved towards one of the few growing trees in the sanctuary. The Night Fury tenderly nudged Hiccup's head before leaping up into the tree's branches with 2 flaps of his wings. Hiccup, now without his scaly protector, and on the same level as Stoic, kept his eyes on him and his body tensed for fight or flight. He had removed his gloves. They were strapped against his shoes to avoid cutting anyone, so his pale hands showed brightly against his dark clothing and the dimness of the nest. Stoic cleared his throat awkwardly. "Good night, son," he said clearly. Hiccup's face twisted in confusion, and slight distaste over the title Stoic had called him. He looked up at his dragon friend and hummed something at him. The Night Fury dropped down, hanging by his tail. His head was about the same height as Stoic's from the ground. He cooed something back at Hiccup and Hiccup shook his head. He looked at Stoic. "Night does not know good and evil," he said, misunderstanding the farewell completely. Stoic chuckled slightly as he sighed, rubbing his forehead. "No, it means, sleep well," he corrected. Hiccup's confusion left and he rolled his shoulders and neck slightly to relieve some tension. He nodded back at Stoic, then stood up with an arm above his head towards his dragon. The Night Fury lowered his front paws and gripped Hiccup's arm back and pulled Hiccup up. Hiccup twisted his body in a terrific display of strength, so he was also upside down, with the Night Fury's legs holding him in place like a four-armed hug. The Night Fury tucked his head down on top of Hiccup's and shifted in their cuddle for a few seconds before drawing his wings around them both and closing his eyes. Hiccup was upside down, probably planning to sleep like that, and concealed entirely within his dragon's embrace. Stoic was amazed that his son did everything with dragons. He even slept like one. He didn't know of many people who could stand being upside down for long, let alone sleep entire nights that way. It was not human. He glanced over at Valka and saw her large dragon curled up like a cat or dog before a fire, with his top wings open. Valka was watching Hiccup get into position, her face suspicious as if she expected him to sneak out. Stoic wondered if he did that often, but a soft call from her dragon behind her made her turn her attention away and climb into the comfortable nest he had made out of his limbs and wings. Once she had lain down and gotten comfortable, the four-winged beast folded his smaller set of wings around her like a blanket, then the larger ones on top like a tent. He closed his large golden eyes and was still. Stoic glanced between his family, both sleeping in unique ways with their companions and guardians wrapped around them for safety. It was unnatural for him to see. Dragons at home would never act so calm, or be so welcoming. The ones on Berk were terrifying, murderous monsters who attacked on sight and often left with the blood of his people splattered along their wings and dripping from their fangs. To see them be so gentle, nurturing and caring had capsized his world. He never dreamed they could be so kind. Was it trickery? An act? No. No creature could fake the feelings in their eyes when those dragons looked at each other, or their riders. The expecting parents, the loyal friends, the confusing family love, and the bond between a rider and a dragon. Vikings were wrong. Stoic rubbed his forehead, feeling weary as his thoughts burst through barriers and barricades of traditions and beliefs that held his world in balance, that gave his chiefdom reason. It was all wrong. He needed to sleep on what he had discovered today, and definitely message his men. The last thing he wanted was a power struggle or them making a pact with Drago without his authority keeping the madman in check. He sighed heavily and moved over to the furs. He only removed some armor before laying down, too tired physically and mentally to attempt his normal nightly routine. The furs were unfamiliar, and smelled strongly of the sea air, and the lumps of the rocks they were positioned on kept him shifting and scratching for a comfortable spot to sleep. The night was full of late-night dragon calls, snores, and soft pattering footsteps and wing beats, all noises that kept him from relaxing. Then there was the unnatural dark and warmth from the haven. Nothing was familiar to him. But eventually even he was captured by sleep, to be released back into chaos and new discoveries tomorrow. Maybe Valka would teach him something new, maybe Hiccup would talk to him again, maybe suddenly calling dragons hims and hers wouldn't sound so ridiculous. Maybe. Stoic grunted and closed his eyes. Maybe was so Viking. Maybe after this he wouldn't be a Viking. Stoic sighed and prepared to brace for tomorrow. underscore 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 underscore. Hiccup woke within his brother's wings and smiled softly. He rested his head to his brother's chest and listened carefully to his heart. Slow like the warm air over the land, he was asleep. Hiccup closed his eyes and went back into a doze. His thoughts began to wander over the past few days to when the stranger, the Viking alpha, mother's mate, had been allowed in the nest. Underscore 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 underscore. Toothless swings were strong and fast as they raised the thunder drums beneath them. Of course the sea flyers had no chance against Toothless, he as fast as the oncoming darkness. A fact they were both proud of. They had once flown around the world at breakneck speed, keeping the sun an inch above the horizon for the entire trip before crashing back at the nest exhausted. Valka and Cloudjumper had been furious at them at first. Gone for an entire day with silent parting words. But then, once their adventure came to light, they were fascinated. There was no edge of the world, and it was smaller than Vikings thought it was. Hiccup was very proud of Toothless, boasting of his dragon speed and endurance. He was humbled to be his chosen brother. But Toothless looked into his eyes and spoke just as grandly of Hiccup, how he could have never done it without Hiccup by his side, claiming it was Hiccup who unlocked his strength and speed and gave them their achievement. As confusing as this claim was, Hiccup saw and felt no lies in his brother's words. Toothless felt he needed him to be great. Their tail quickly around the nest, and to visitors. They gained new names that day. They were the Day Chasers, they with the speed of the sun. Hiccup lay flat as his brother caught up with a pod of nomadic thunder drums. The whistle of the wind gave away their approach. The thunder drums bellowed their greetings both under and over the waves. Fair wind, high flyers. I am Queen Jewelstrike. We are Loud Sea Dwellers, Surf Shaker, Salt Break, Sandclaws, Blood Billow, Deep Seeker, Haley, Crusttooth. The Queen listed the names of her beloved family. The names were listed in order of rank, determined by lung size and raw volume. The loudest was the first named, and their queen held their mutual respect and protected her own. Hiccup shifted so his legs rested over his brother's wings. He sat up and they roared back once their introductions had finished. To interrupt was to challenge and disrespect the queen. Whoever spoke first was not to be interrupted. Normally the guest spoke second in the home of the first, but in a place with no home it was the larger group who spoke first. It was pointless to start confrontation. Toothless perked at some of the names. They had heard stories and songs of this pod. They had found an ocean where the water was always as warm as the Scaldron's breath. In reply they roared together. Strong tides, loud sea dwellers. We are, Night Scream, Blue Flame, Toothless, Human Dragon Child, Hiccup. A thunder drum roared and glided above the waves. Her yellow eye met theirs in recognition. Day Chasers. She named them. Hiccup grinned and puffed out his chest proudly. Toothless below him has his head raised to the sky. Their bodies confirmed her naming, and they roared in pride. Toothless playfully skimmed a claw through the water, keeping at the thunder drum's pace. He huffed with smoke in his mouth and drilled over the rushing water and air. Warm Sea Explorers. He named them, difficult to say such a name while flying. The pod all launched out of the water with bellows of agreement. Toothless had named them correctly. Hiccup laughed, but knew he had to warn them. Queen of Sea Dwellers, there was only so much that could be said without using his full body. He hoped she would understand. He pointed west and whimpered while cringing into a bow on his brother's back. To the sunset direction dwells a fearsome queen. He clicked and barked as clearly as he could and covered his ears before throwing his arms out like wings and lowering them into a forced submitting pose, a mockery of a bow to the alpha. Stay away from the sunset direction. She will steal your freedom and rename you Imran. Imran, the cursed name for dragons without a name and without freedom. Names were powerful in dragons. They told strangers what you were, told part of your story, held part of your personality, could be remembered long after your death, and was key in establishing what your relationship was with another. But most importantly, it gave a dragon individuality and freedom. To not have a name, to be called Imran, was a fate worse than death. No name was no freedom, no individuality, and no existence. You were a slave. The Queen of the Pod felt the truth in Hiccup's words, and took them seriously when Toothless added his own message of she brings sadness and death, flee her voice. Jewel Strike rumbled loudly with a soft bow to her spine. Thank you, she turned to the sunrise direction, we will listen to your truths and avoid. Fly well, day chasers. Toothless tensed his body, and Hiccup moved in sync without thinking, his body knew what this meant. He gripped Toothless' shoulder bones and tucked his knees into his wing pits to grip on tight as Toothless spun under the surfacing wing of the Queen Thunderdrum and then shot towards the clouds. Hiccup laughed and pressed low to Toothless' back. He drilled into Toothless' ears, ending on a roar of glory that his brother quickly copied. Happy. Faster, brother mine. The sky is ours. Toothless moved into the clouds, their figures cut through the obscuring sky water without sound or resistance. Hiccup felt the power in Toothless' wings and felt, like every time, the rhythms of Toothless' body as his own. He could almost feel the strain of muscles he didn't have, the feeling of air being pushed beneath him, the joy that came with flying. He felt the icy air through his protective mask and grinned. Toothless started their normal game. Can you hold on? The game was nearly pointless for them at this age. With this bond, Hiccup could read Toothless' body actions and unconsciously knew what he was going to do before he consciously did. Sometimes even before Toothless himself knew. But it was fun, and challenging and always new, and it always proved just how right they were as brothers. When they flew they were one, united by the air, and the wing. Brothers of the wing, the Alpha himself had described them as once. The first move was a slow arch upside down. Hiccup leaned back to keep the blood from rushing entirely to his head and so he could keep his bearings. He looked down through the clouds and saw the sea below. The sun glinted off Toothless' scales and made him glow. Hiccup grinned behind his mask. His body language spoke for him, confidence. He was only gripping his brother with his tightly folded legs, clamping his wing membrane against the back of his knees. This move was too easy. Toothless looked back at him with one green eye and snorted. He followed the arch around, flipping back over to use gravity's energy to arch back into the sky. He tensed, Hiccup gripped, and then he flattened all wings and paws against his body to spin faster than a typhoon into the sky. Toothless spun faster and faster while ascending into the clouds until Hiccup's head forgot what was up or down. But he held on and rumbled constantly, letting Toothless know what he was feeling: dizzy, enjoyment, determination. Hiccup placed a hand on his brother's forehead and laughed. Enjoyment. Higher, brother mine, more. Toothless cleared the clouds, paused spinning and then let gravity force them to fall back to earth. Toothless roared back at Hiccup. Enjoyment. Challenge. Hiccup had an arm around his neck as they fell back into the clouds. Hiccup saw his brother's wings open to control the fall, which was a glide actually because dragons didn't fall. Hiccup leaned against Toothless and crooned lightly to himself. He was glad to be with his brother, he was happiest by Toothless' side. Toothless hummed back and spun twice more on the descent to regain the lost air under his wings, then swooped through clouds to start another slow barrel turn. Hiccup had forgotten about the challenge and lifted his arms to mirror Toothless' wings. He closed his eyes and breathed as Toothless flew, making him believe he was flying too. A single word escaped his lips: body, and emotions, free. Toothless also left the game behind and raised his head to watch a group of typhoomerangs fly overhead. He ignored them to turn into all the air currents around them so his brother could feel the wind against his limbs and imagine flying. Hiccup sighed and loosened all his grips on Toothless as they calmly glided along the clouds. Hiccup looked into the sky and then patted Toothless' neck just behind an ear flap. He hummed and clicked excitedly with his arms shaking. I long for the sky, I want to spread my wings. Toothless tensed and let out a hummed cough of concern, a rising intention of surprise before fading into a warble of disagreement. Worry. Brother mine, I fear you will fall. Hiccup huffed and stood on Toothless' neck, balancing and leaning perfectly with his brother to keep upright and balanced. Scorn. I will be fine. He crouched again when he felt Toothless look sadly down, silently saying, "I will not stop you, but I do not like it." Hiccup hated making Toothless sad, so nuzzled an ear flap gently while humming, rubbing a hand along his forehead and wings. "Love. Thank you, brother mine, for protecting me. I have no fear with you by my side." Toothless perked up and gave his gummy grin. Hiccup grinned back, though no one could see, and crouched again, leaning to one side. He chirped inquisitively. "Ready?" Toothless rumbled in agreement. Hiccup breathed, then jumped from Toothless' back and plummeted down towards the earth, arms and legs pressed tightly into a line for speed. He roared in pure delight. "Happy free, love, happy free." Toothless twisted in midair after a moment and then swooped down to join him. He twisted in the air, eventually coming to spin around Hiccup in perfect harmony. Hiccup turned his head from the exhilarating fall to look at Toothless. He smiled so widely his eyes nearly shut. Toothless saw and opened his mouth in a gummy smile too, his tongue flapping at one side in a funny way. Hiccup laughed and nearly lost concentration. Toothless barked warningly and turned to glide at his pace over him. They could see the bottom of the clouds now. Hiccup twisted his body so the spinning stopped, and so he was falling at the correct angle. He breathed in the free fall one more time before grabbing the leather hoops and pulling his arms upwards, freeing the fabric of his fake wings. At once the air caught under them and his gliding slowed. To Toothless it appeared he had gained height, but they knew better. Hiccup yelped unconsciously as he adjusted to the speed reduction and the strain of his arms. He paused to punch his chest and open the back wing flap, which allowed him to steer since he had no other wings or tail for stability. Then he was flying. Toothless watched him with growing confidence and pride. He came to a realization as Hiccup crowed in triumph. He hummed it just loud enough for Hiccup to hear. "Brother mine, you belong here too." Hiccup looked over his shoulder. Toothless had made him feel so happy with his words. Toothless titled his head and glided beside him, wondering what he would do next. Hiccup skimmed a cloud and howled in joy again. Though muffled by the mask, it did nothing to hide the joyful freedom and adrenaline he was feeling. Toothless let out a plasma blast and Hiccup leaned into the hot air that came from the fire. He gained a few feet in height and cheered with joy. Toothless did it a few more times until they were almost back to their original gliding height. Hiccup saw heavy cloud before him and knew from experience that they gathered around the land. He called out a warning to Toothless and dropped his fake wings and arms to his sides, falling once again. Toothless flattened himself, clicked out his hidden back fins discovered when they were 10, and swept under Hiccup's falling body to catch him. Hiccup linked his arms and legs around Toothless' neck and stayed silent as Toothless sounded several short sonic clicks. Hiccup couldn't hear or use sonic sounds. Few dragons could. It was one of the things that made Toothless unique. Hiccup knew he wasn't a dragon by blood or birth or flesh and bone, thus depriving him of wings, fire, scales and their extra senses and abilities. But he was a dragon in everything that mattered: the heart, the mind, the emotions, the soul. He relied on Toothless for things and learned from him to make up for his birth species failures, like his fake wings, the fire sword, armor with scales under the leather for protection, clawed gloves and language. Toothless navigated through the fog with no trouble and landed them on a clear cliff in a patch of rare sunshine. Hiccup slid from Toothless' back, chirping and chattering constantly as he smoothed down his wings for later, and turned a hidden lever to pull his back fin back into place. He got that idea when he found an abandoned boat that used a lever to put up sails and combined it with a spring he had found in a distant land. Everything he had on him took years of tinkering, curiosity and patience, and he still wasn't out of ideas to try. Excitement. Happiness. I was flying. I was free. I was correct, nothing to worry about. Brother mine, you worry too much. More. Later must fly more. Toothless respectfully waited until Hiccup's equipment was away. He knew and had seen the hours of work poured into each piece and didn't want to break anything. But the moment it was all away, he pounced on him. He snagged him mid-jump and coiled his wings around him to cushion the fall before sweeping the wings back out to pin his littler brother. Hiccup squawked indignantly at first, then began to laugh and play the game. Toothless had one paw firmly on his chest. Hiccup grabbed it and quickly jabbed a few pressure points in the joints to make Toothless jerk back, though he never did it hard enough to hurt, just to trick him with his instinctive reactions. If something dug suddenly into his paw's wrist, he would back up to avoid pain. It was no different than a human drawing back instinctively from touching something hot. Being smaller meant that Hiccup had to survive by being smarter. He pushed Toothless' paw off him and took a few playful swipes with his clawed gloves at Toothless' head as Toothless began to pat back down on him, trying to trap his hands. Both pointed their claws away from the other as they batted like a pair of kittens or wrestling cubs. Hiccup saw Toothless look sneaky and didn't have time to so much as brace before Toothless flopped his heavy head and neck on top of him. Hiccup huffed out all his air at once and groaned as the winded sensation took over. He went limp under Toothless' weight. Toothless rumbled in humor and proceeded to lick Hiccup all over. Hiccup began to protest and struggle as all dragons did when they came face to face with a bath. "No. I'm clean. I don't need to be cleaned." He tucked his feet under Toothless' chin and kicked himself into an over-the-shoulder roll to get away from him. He shook his head vigorously before rolling on the grass and rubbing at his armor. Toothless chortled as Hiccup complained at the licking he had just endured. It was amusing to see Hiccup fuss and protest like a hatchling or squawk like a baby bird, but he worried slightly when Hiccup began expressing a deeper upset than indignation. He cooed and butted his head into Hiccup's sulking shoulder. "Is brother mine angry at me?" Hiccup grumbled and shifted as if he was saying yes, but his eyes and body said no. Eventually he turned and pulled off his helmet mask and buried his face into Toothless' neck. "Never mad. I love brother mine." Toothless hummed in contentment and lightly sniffed all over Hiccup's body. He trilled and crooned happily before resting his head so he could hear Hiccup's heartbeat on his thin chest. "Our scents are one. All will know you are most dear to my heart." Hiccup smiled. Toothless leaned a little too hard and undid the spring, making his back fin expand again. Hiccup laughed and hugged Toothless closer. It made him feel like a dragon if he had the fin. He only pulled back to allow Toothless to lay down and fold the fin back down so it wouldn't get damaged. He scooted over and folded himself against Toothless' body and hummed lowly, relaxing for a midday nap. He rubbed Toothless' wings and cooed and hummed at him, settling his ear close to Toothless' heart too. "You are most dear to my heart." He grumbled slightly and rubbed his damp hair against Toothless' wings. "I don't like baths, you never bath." Toothless opened one eye and cooed and hummed at his disgruntled brother. "Scales hold scents longer than brother mine's no scales fur." He gently reminded Hiccup of that important fact. Scents were almost as important as names. They told other dragons about your relations. For example, every dragon in the Alpha's nest carried traces of his scent. His was most powerful and distinctive, though it was often an underlayer, and then individual dragons carried the scents of themselves and those they interacted most with. It absorbed into a complex structure as detailed as a dragon's entire social life. Hiccup lost his scents easily, so often had very close contact with his favorite dragons and the Alpha to ensure others knew who he was friends with. He also couldn't smell them very well. Toothless was his translator in the areas in which he failed. Hiccup sighed and curled up properly, resting on Toothless' forepaw and relaxing under the sun. Toothless spread his wings to absorb the sun's heat and began to drift to sleep, Hiccup's scent lulling him into calmness. Hiccup was less likely to actually sleep, but a light doze was enjoyable, and the warmth of the sun was quickly relaxing him further. Underscore 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 underscore. An hour had passed when Toothless stirred, his nostrils flaring as he picked up an unusual smell. He perked up, disturbing Hiccup, who promptly began to whine, and sniffed the air for more clues as to what had disturbed him: smoke, metal, dragons, humans, blood, wood and lots of fear. He rumbled a low warning to Hiccup. Hiccup stopped whining at once and twisted to crouch on all fours and inhale the air too. He could only smell the smoke, but knew from the smell that a ziplyback and some kind of stone-eating dragon had fired recently. He clicked slightly and shifted his front claws before edging forwards. Danger. Wariness. Seek and find. Toothless investigated through scent for a little longer before snorting angrily and growling. Human trappers. Hiccup instinctively twisted his face into a snarl too. He replaced his mask and growled as he punched the ground. Enemy. He cooed through his next growls: trapped dragons with enemy. Toothless granted an affirmative, and Hiccup at once began to beg Toothless to go and investigate, to save the dragons or at least see what backup was needed. Toothless huffed in agreement and let Hiccup climb on his back. They glided low over the land towards the trail of smoke, but soon it led to a human ocean base, and not a floating tree. Hiccup couldn't remember what his mother had called the floating trees, but horrible Vikings used them a lot. But these human trappers were not using floating trees. Toothless hesitated a moment before grunting lowly and growling a quick warning as he inhaled a huge lungful of air. "Brother mine, still your breath." Hiccup sucked in several deep breaths, then held and burrowed his face into Toothless' neck as the dragon dived below the waves and swam towards the human nest. Hiccup felt Toothless fold his wings tightly and use his lower fins and tail to swim like a dolphin, one of those not fish which were really friendly when they visited. They taught Hiccup how to swim. Hiccup watched their movements and copied. Mother never had time since she always flew. Toothless swam fast. Hiccup was thankful because his lungs weren't as large as his. He needed air frequently. He tapped Toothless' back and they neared the surface for Hiccup to gasp in a new breath before diving. They were halfway. Toothless beached at a convenient hidden spot and let Hiccup sneak further after listening intently. There were no humans nearby. Underscore 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 underscore. Hiccup inched closer into the human nest and peered around a door. Inside were humans eating and making noise. Hiccup knew Norse, but couldn't understand people when they were drunk and slurring. He wrinkled his nose at the alcoholic smell and darted around the doorway to the next room. This room was more interesting. There was a lot of paper and lots of maps. Hiccup never needed a map, he just needed the stars, sun, moon and wind, and a dragon never hurt either to know where he was. But maps showed where humans had been and where they were going. He looked at the map and saw several pins and notes newly placed. He pulled open one of his armored sleeves and opened the book he had hidden there. It was a waterproof compartment to protect from condensation mostly, but it also had some protection against submersion too, so the paper was dry. He wrote down where the hunters had been and where they were heading in his odd little note form. Not even his mother understood how he recorded things, but the scribbles and symbols made perfect sense to him. He also stole some smaller bits of paper which looked important and shoved them in the book pages too before sealing the armor up and keeping the goods safe. Little did he know that one piece of paper would change his immediate future. Hiccup heard someone approaching and hid and climbed through the rafters for the next few rooms with guards, and then he found the room with the trapped dragons. He softly began to coo a message them, too low for the stupid hunters to hear, but the dragons would hear. "Friend human dragon child Hiccup. Help. Rescue." The dragons in their pit cages below began to call back. To a Viking it was all meaningless noise all said together. But to Hiccup it was information. Lots of it. Trapped. Hunter metal trap. Fear. Sharp sticks, paralyzing stinging things, fire, flying sharp fire. Yes, help. Hope. Run with your freedom. Hurt. Leg and tail. Eyes covered. Blind. Fear. Many hunters. 2 terrapacks. White kind alphas Hiccup. Hiccup perked and hooted softly. Alphas Hiccup. He confirmed. The dragon hit the bars of his cage and roared slightly. It was a rumble horn which had its eyes covered by a tied cloth, which made it angry and scared, and thus more angry. Hiccup could not see him and his nose was not sensitive enough for scents from more than a foot or two. So he called out. Name. Friend. The rumble horn stomped loud enough for Hiccup to hear and tossed his head with a roar. Skull Crusher. Forest Defender. Hiccup jumped and felt a little worried. He was one of the nest's defenders and he had still gotten captured. The nest defenders were highly skilled dragons in combat, stealth and firepower. Hiccup realized that he was out of his depth and would need the help of other dragons, more defenders, and champions. Like his mother, she was a champion along with Cloudjumper. She had the respect of other defenders to command them. The Alpha himself approved of this when she protected them from an army of Viking ships. Her human knowledge was only matched by her dragon knowledge, and no dragon was hurt in her battle. She was a very respected member of the nest. Surely she could convince some defenders to help free their kin. But the size of this Viking trap would mean a lot of defenders would be needed for the rescue. He called out lowly to the trapped dragons words of comfort and promise. Determination. Human dragon child Hiccup and toothless brother mine will return with champions for your freedom. Have patience, cling to your names. The noise the dragons were making was starting to draw the drunk Vikings into the room. Hiccup slipped away easily and reunited with Toothless. Underscore 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 underscore. Hiccup jumped down and sat before Toothless with growls and whimpers of disappointment and anger. Regret. Our claws and fire cannot help alone. Toothless looked around and agreed. Vikings too many and too strong for our determination and love for our kin. Brother mine, mother will help, have no doubt Vikings will tremble before our fury. Hiccup agreed with a soft growl. He clung to his brother's back and they took off into the sky as fast as they could to avoid capture themselves. Hiccup spoke once they were hidden in the clouds. Alpha destroy the nest, no dragons becoming Imran later. He thought aloud and could see the problem in letting these Vikings stay to hurt more after they freed this group. Toothless rolled his eyes slightly with a snort. Alpha is mightier than Viking nest, yes. Doubts. Alpha dislikes warring. Hiccup sighed. He knew his Alpha was a peaceful, nurturing leader and was not one to rush into fights or destruction. His mind often touched his subjects absently with thoughts of family, peaceful living, play, knowledge and safety. He was a kind Alpha, and many referred to him as such, the wise, kindly guardian of their nest. Hiccup, however, hoped to appeal to his love for his nest family to have him help destroy the Viking nest with the trapped dragons. Hiccup lay his head on Toothless. Alpha is kind. Alpha loves us. Love can convince him to rescue his loved ones. I will attempt to convince. He decided at last, knowing that it may be a difficult task. But his mind and heart knew it was right. Toothless purred happily to the first statements, and then thoughtfully for the final ones. Brother mine, convince Alpha out of love. Or war? He questioned carefully. Hiccup knew these were heavy questions. He sighed and helplessly flopped against Toothless' back. My heart is weak, it fills with hate for Vikings. It is like a Viking's heart. He closed his eyes and shook in anger at his own nature. But my heart is strong too, it can hold inside every dragon I know, it has too much love. It hurts my heart to see kin become Imran. Toothless purred at last. Brother mine is complicated. Your heart loves more than you hate. Hiccup doesn't want Alpha to kill Vikings, Hiccup asks the Alpha to take away danger. Hiccup smiled and relaxed, rubbed Toothless' neck with a clawed hand. Brother mine, you keep my heart full of fire and empty of Vikings' war. He cooed to himself. It is warm. Fire was anger, love, warm, freedom, but it was not hate. Fire wasn't hateful, hearts could be. Hiccup needed Toothless, and his family of dragons to keep his heart empty of it. Toothless understood how Hiccup struggled with his nature. He thought like a dragon, moved like a dragon, flew, spoke, ate, and lived the life of a dragon. But by birth he was a human, and humans could be very dragon-like, but never completely. Hiccup needed Toothless to guide him away from instinctive human reactions and made him question himself until he had regained his path as a dragon child. Like a strange instinct for war and fighting. Dragons were defensive creatures, but humans could be aggressive for no reason, or aggressive as an overreaction. Hiccup hated that his blood had war in it, and silently thanked Toothless again for helping him keep that part at bay. He was glad Toothless understood him so well. Underscore 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 underscore. Their nest appeared through the clouds and Hiccup shifted on Toothless' back to prepare for the series of tight turns through ice and rock that led to the center. Hiccup twisted with toothless spine and shoulders as he turned this way and that. Hiccup occasionally had to throw his weight a little more into a turn to compensate for his weight upsetting the balance. They moved like a pair of wings, each one in sync. When they reached the sanctuary, Hiccup's face split in a smile. It was always so good to have a beautiful, safe home to come back to. The alpha dozed below, the babies stomped and dripped around the rocks of the mountain, the gronkles slept in an afternoon nap, and the nightmares and ziply-backs flew in the air around the pillars to stretch their wings. Hiccup sat up and began to roar into the noise of his fellow nestmates. Mother! Guardian Cloudjumper! Mother! Toothless added his own roars and also called for Cloudjumper. Soon his ears twitched in the direction of a roared reply. Here! Secret's den! Here! Hiccup dismounted smoothly when Toothless had landed in the secret den. It wasn't much of a secret, but it was a shallow cave covered in human stuff for Valka and the dragons to learn from. Cloudjumper was resting outside and he exhaled in greeting. Valka turned and smiled from examining a piece of metal. Hiccup, Toothless. Her smile widened and she clasped a hand to her heart as they approached. Happiness in my heart. You are safe. Then her head tilted, causing her slowly graying hair to shift to one side. She clicked and crooned as she spread her arms. Confusion. You have come home early. Hiccup nodded and stepped up to her to hold her, tucking his head under her chin. Love. Sadness. Valka held him and nuzzled his hair adoringly as she flexed her arms. Comfort. Love. Safety is promised. Toothless butted his head against her and mournfully called whilst his tail trashed and his claws dug into the earth as his wings shifted open slightly. Sadness. Anger. Family of our alpha are trapped. Valka stiffened and snarled. Cloudjumper perked and his eyes narrowed in anger. Also, how dare family be trapped? Hiccup stepped out of his mother's hold and began to describe the place he had seen, and the dragons who were trapped. Valka said nothing verbally, but her body spoke for her. Interest. Anger. Concern. Frustration. Determination. Hiccup opened his armored sleeve and pulled out the bits of paper. I take from Vikings. There was technically no word for stole, though dragons knew the difference. Hiccup scattered them and began to pore over them with his mother. Hiccup hooted and trilled. Helpful. Valka leaned over with a brief smile to nudge her shoulder against his. Always. She picked up a letter, not that Hiccup could tell the difference, and read it. That was the piece that would change their world. She quickly paled, silently saying, intense fear. No, no, no. Her hands tightened on the paper and she read again with fast eye movements. Hiccup whimpered in worry and touched her arm. Concern. Cloudjumper leaned over and exhaled on the back of her neck, nuzzling her shoulder comfortingly. Comfort. Valka finally turned and buried her head in Cloudjumper's neck and shuddered. Fear. No, no, no. Hiccup whimpered. Scared. Mother. Valka pulled away from Cloudjumper, but her hand never left his neck. She needed his support. She looked more serious than Hiccup had ever seen her. Hiccup couldn't clearly read her, she was so closed and silent. Silence wasn't common in dragons, even without voices they were always talking. Hiccup desperately searched her face to try and hear her silent voice, resigned. Regret. Fear. Determination. Fear. Courage. Hiccup reached out with his gloved hands and took her hand in his. He whimpered again. Mother, why are you silent? Valka closed her eyes and her back bowed slightly. I am burdened. She looked at him again and sighed. Hiccup. Hiccup's eyes widened. Mother never spoke in Norse unless it was about human things for which dragons had no words for. He felt fear creep into him. Toothless saw his fear and pressed his chest against Hiccup's back, curling his tail around his knees. Hiccup pressed back in silent thanks, too focused on his mother to do any more. Mother, he returned. His Norse always sounded bad, not that he put any effort in anyway, but it was a jumble of sounds that often twisted his tongue uncomfortably, and never sounded as nice as his mother's voice. Valka breathed and squeezed his hand in hers, turning to kneel before him and place her hands on his shoulders. Comfort. Be strong. Remember what I told you about your sire, she asked. Hiccup nodded slowly. My sire is a human, he killed dragons. He growled a little at the phrase. I am not like him. Cloudjumper rescued us from fighting Imran and Vikings, and brought us here to be safe, he said, recalling the story from the childhood days in which he had asked. Once he knew his sire was a dragon killer, a murderer, he had no desire to learn anymore. Valka nodded and squeezed his shoulders again. He was a very important Viking. He is the chief of Berk the Viking Alpha, she added when Hiccup's head tilted at the unfamiliar word. Hiccup's muscles tensed and he looked highly uncomfortable. Viking Alpha, he repeated. A human of importance, the strongest of the human nest, the best fighter and lead killer. He shuddered slightly, wanting to scratch at his own flesh for having that human's blood in his body. Valka looked sadly at him, reading his inner struggle. His name is Stoic. We were mates before we were brought here. I haven't seen him since you were a babe, but now I may have no choice but to see him again and reveal our existence. Hiccup looked confused. Why? Valka held up the piece of paper. This is a letter to Drago. They both snarled slightly at the name. Stoic wants to ally his tribe, his nest with Drago. His tribe is very strong and they both hate dragons so much. Once the other human nests see what Stoic and Berk is doing, they will follow his example because Berk is very respected. It will put even our Alpha at risk, she finished. Hiccup stood up and shrieked in outrage. No. Alpha I will protect with my life. Alpha is most powerful. Vikings will not take our family. Toothless had roared with his protests and Cloudjumper hissed with his head fins fluttering in anger. Valka waited until Hiccup was calm. Enough, Hiccup, she ordered. Hiccup swallowed his next yells and silently seethed instead. Valka looked back at the paper. There is not point shouting. It is what will be, unless we stop it. Hiccup looked at his mother fearfully and crooned with a slight warble of fear. Fear. Must we fly to war? Valka shook her head. No, but, maybe we can, change Stoic's mind. Hiccup snorted, tossing his head slightly. Scorn. Humor. Valka raised an eyebrow at him, a human expression that Hiccup knew meant something like, explain your foolish reaction. Hiccup clicked a few times as he crouched down to press himself against Toothless' front leg for comfort. He put a hand on Toothless as he explained himself. Vikings do not change. You said we were born different, without war in our bodies. They cannot forget war, each one is the same. Valka sighed and nodded yes. She hummed and flicked her hands outwards with the palms down and intonated her voice upwards as she clicked. I hope to convince their Alpha so others will obey his decisions. Their Alpha is your sire. He will want to protect his kin. I hope he will turn against Drago for you. Hiccup frowned and looked up at his brother with a worried expression. Toothless cooed. Brother mine is afraid. Hiccup whimpered and pressed his head to Toothless' neck and held him weakly. I fear for your life, brother mine. Murderers with our family is dangerous. Valka moved crouching forwards and held both of them in her arms as best she could. Valka nuzzled them both, making Hiccup's face relax into a smile, and Toothless purr happily at her message, comfort. Never be afraid, we will be together. Cloudjumper held them all with his wings a moment later. We will be together. He agreed. The greatness of his large wings made Hiccup feel very safe. Nothing could reach him here in the arms of his family. His arms pressed around his mother and Toothless, a palm against Cloudjumper's wing as his size made embracing impractical. Hiccup trilled absently and tension left his body. I feel safe with Guardian Cloudjumper. Cloudjumper purred in pride and breathed hot air onto Hiccup's face. Hiccup grinned and Cloudjumper's eyes widened affectionately. Happiness. I will always keep you safe, precious Hiccup. Hiccup just hummed and shifted as if he was going to sleep again, curling against Cloudjumper's inner wing. While Hiccup got comfortable, Toothless raised his head and nuzzled Valka while he crooned inquisitively, his large eyes looking at the paper half covered in Cloudjumper's wings. Mother, about the Viking Alpha, what do you intend? Valka smiled and nuzzled his nose affectionately as Hiccup twisted himself to lay his head in her lap and stare up at her curiously. Toothless lay down also, resting his head on Hiccup's stomach. Hiccup remembered listening to his mother's plan of taking the Viking Alpha and letting him observe their daily lives to show him that dragons were people too. It sounded good, but Vikings weren't good, so Hiccup had doubts. but he kept them silent. Then had come the convincing of the Alpha. Hiccup was grateful to him for helping free the Imran. He even agreed to destroy the trapper's nest in the name of protecting them all. He even agreed to let Mother's mate and Viking Alpha enter the nest. That last agreement Hiccup was worried about, but he was confident his Alpha would protect him, and that Mother and Cloudjumper, his guardian, would be with him. And of course he would never leave Toothless' side. But the Viking Alpha's focus on himself was making Hiccup uncomfortable. Underscore 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 underscore. Hiccup's mind was about to wander to the Alpha's conversation when Toothless began to shift around him. Hiccup's thoughts went from his memories to his best friend and brother. He was finally waking up. Hiccup cooed and pressed his head into Toothless' chest. "Brother mine." Toothless purred back sleepily and stretched his wings. His limbs tightened around Hiccup fractionally and Hiccup closed his eyes contently, returning the loving greeting. Toothless nuzzled his hair and carefully shifted his paws to let Hiccup down. Hiccup held the same limb from last night and twisted his body back over his head to land in a crouch on the ground. Hiccup absently ran a hand through his hair and stretched to loosen his stiff bones. Toothless yawned and pulled himself up onto the tree branch to shake out his body. Hiccup laughed at him and hooted and chirped a few playful jibes at the larger brother, calling too sleepy and too dreamy, before Toothless dropped on top of him, pinning him once again. "Caught." The dragon warbled as he placed his paw on Hiccup's chest. Hiccup whined when Toothless laughed at him, deep and chortling. He gripped Toothless' paw and shifted it so it was not stopping him breathe. He hummed and looked as sorry as he could, making his eyes big and cooing endearments, knowing it was all a game to them both. Toothless eventually let him up, and nuzzled his hair and face delicately, licking here and there to rid Hiccup of sleepy eyes and his bedhead. Hiccup smiled and stayed still for morning grooming, tilting his head whichever way to let Toothless get on with it. Toothless licked over the scrapes on his knuckles and any odd scratches where they were visible. Dragon saliva was good for cuts and burns as chance of infection was really low. Toothless finished up with a playful lick to Hiccup's face, making the boy splutter. Hiccup was low maintenance thanks to no scales, so Toothless was done quickly once he was sure Hiccup was clean. Toothless on the other hand needed a little more care every morning. Hiccup wiped his face on his hands and pulled his hair back into place while Toothless began to clean his claws. Hiccup hummed and clicked absently as he picked up a tuft of grass and began to inspect the dragon's eyes and ears. He gently rubbed over Toothless' closed eye with the grass to wipe away any water build-up and sleep. He was very careful with his ears, cleaning out any sand or moisture that could be irritating. Since he had so many, this was important. Earaches had left Toothless grounded before, too irritated and painful to fly. Toothless and Hiccup exchanged absent nudges and touches throughout their grooming, not talking consciously, but speaking nonetheless. "I love you, brother mine." Hiccup was just finishing inspecting Toothless' wings as Toothless did the same for his tail, when he finally sensed eyes on him. It was not a dragon sense, paranoia, so Hiccup and Valka were the only ones with this ability. But it was one thing that had kept them a step ahead, so he had learned to listen to it. He turned his head sharply and saw the Viking Alpha watching them from his cave. Toothless moved to look at almost the same moment. The Viking Alpha was watching silently, his helmet in one hand and a cup of water in the other. He was watching them, or Hiccup, intently. With curious eyes and silent body. Hiccup's shoulders rose and he tucked himself under Toothless' wing slightly, making a nasal growl and clicking with his teeth as his hands gestured before him, directed at Toothless, but his eyes never left the threatening larger human. Discomfort. Too close. Want comfort. Viking Alpha wants me. Do not want his focus. Fear. What if he makes me leave you? Toothless had looked up the second Hiccup had, seeing him move and break their silent conversation of emotion and attention. He looked calmly at the Viking Alpha. He was weaponless and alone. Toothless carefully curled his tail around Hiccup, turning to tuck him into a reptilian hug. Comfort. Do not be afraid. We will be together, brother mine. I'll protect. He knew that Hiccup was in no danger of being taken away, but he knew that having some unwanted attention was a very anxious experience. Hunters always gave him unwanted attention. Hiccup relaxed a little and warily returned to rubbing the grass over the joints and wing membrane, just to brush off any loose scales. He had his face turned halfway to keep the Viking Alpha in his peripheral vision. However, that didn't reduce the quality of his wing maintenance. Old scales fell to reveal shiner, harder new ones. Hiccup traced one with the palm of his hand. It was smoother than the air they cut through. Soon he pulled himself up onto Toothless's back and clicked out his back fins with a press to the back of his skull. Toothless could do it himself, but Hiccup knew all his pressure points and action spots, which made Toothless move how he wanted. There were several that he used often, the paw one in playful wrestling, his back fins for speedier flying, a spot under his chin that made him fall asleep due to nerve overload. Toothless shifted under him but didn't react, and Hiccup carefully rubbed each spike until he was sure any loose scales were gone. Toothless hummed when they were finished. Hiccup slid down his wing and began to gather all the old scales that had fallen off. As Hiccup gathered, Toothless sniffed at Hiccup's lower legs where his fake wings were. "Are your wings as prepared as mine?" Hiccup purred and pocketed the scales in his secret paper holder. "Yes, I intend to have them scaled." Toothless looked excited and nodded vigorously, approving of the idea. Hiccup would hold his scent longer and be more protected with scales. He always liked it when Hiccup made something that was helpful to his survival. But the moment was shattered when a large dragon came home from an early patrol. Above them, Cloudjumper roared, swooping into the sanctuary as fast as he could, leaving smaller dragons fumbling in his wake. "Alpha!" Hiccup and Toothless looked up in alarm, crouching out of instinct and their eyes wide at the fear all over his scream. Cloudjumper flew in and aimed to land before the stirring Alpha, a limp dragon in his claws. Hiccup stood up with his breath stuck in his body, his heat pounding. He ran to the edge of the cliff and shook his head weakly. "No. Not again. Hiccup." Hiccup turned at the human voice. The Viking Alpha had moved closer, his eyes curious and his body warily confused. Confusion. Want to know. Hiccup read, heard, and saw his communication. The Viking Alpha pointed at the commotion. "What's going on?" Hiccup felt his entire body shift in anger, his hands clenched, he was glad his claws were away, and his breath snarled as if he would start spitting flames. He screamed as an explanation, one that echoed throughout the nest and into the voices of other dragons. Loss. Anger. Frustration. Your fault. Murderers, he screeched. Underscore 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 underscore. Stoic leapt back when his son shrieked in anger, his scream the same as his dragon's, his face twisting into something he had seen on nearly every face in his village after an unfortunate raid: grief and anger. Hiccup shook once his lungs had exhausted themselves with the scream. His next breath fueled his next yell, this time in a sound he recognized. Murderers. The Night Fury howled slightly too before running towards the cliff, opening his wings and picking up his son on his back before flying down to the crowd of gathering reptiles. Stoic looked confused. Murderers. Vikings. There was a hurt dragon down there. He looked down and saw distantly Valka running across and in between crowding dragons to get to the fallen one, her calls and cries in dragon tongue sounding as panicked as she had once for hurt Vikings, her staff swinging wildly to keep her balance while running. Then she fell to her knees in the shadow of her large dragon and in the face of the Dragon King. Hiccup jumped and landed on Cloudjumper's shoulders and slid down to join his mother while the Night Fury awkwardly landed in a constricted space and looked on at the dragon on his side. Stoic couldn't see much from here and began to track down to find out what was happening, and what was being done. Underscore 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 Valka woke early, while it was still dark, and anxiously made her way to the tunnels. Cloudjumper had woken her up when a night scout had approached with a worried message of a hunter's ship too close to the nest. Cloudjumper flew off to investigate. He went alone because Valka would have been useless in the dark with her less keen senses. She let her fellow champion fly to the rescue in her stead while she went to inspect the tunnels. With the ever-shifting ice and rocks of their home, she had to ensure that a hidden way in had not opened and left them vulnerable. As far as she could tell, there was no way a human could get in. Later she would ask Toothless to make sure his sonic cries were far more accurate than a human's eyes. But she had to do something while waiting for day, and she couldn't sleep with her dear dragon brother away from her. Valka eventually came to sit in the mouth of a small cave with several sleepy terrors cuddling into her legs, facing the alpha as they slept. Valka relaxed as best she could without Cloudjumper near. It was strange to be without his comforting presence looming over her like a mother bear. She caught herself several times from commenting on her thoughts aloud. There was no dragon awake to hear her, no brother to reply. Valka sighed and relaxed in the lightening sanctuary, closing her eyes halfway and emptying her mind to view the alpha's dreams. He was always connected to them, even her despite her being human. All dragons of their nest could hear his absent thoughts as background noise when they were close to him, and they often shared his dreams when their emotions were calm and their minds were open. A dragon which dreamed independently often had a stronger emotion blocking the alpha's influence from their subconscious, like fear, grief, sadness, anger, hunger, love, excitement, happiness. But if one was calm, they could dream with him. Valka learned to meditate into the right mindset in the first few years of living here, something Hiccup never had to learn, much to her envy. He merely sat before the alpha and he could hear him, much like a dragon. Valka had to be near and concentrate to hear him. How privileged her son was, she thought with a swell of pride. With her mind empty and her eyes half closed, her mind was gently swept away into a dream filled with playing hatchlings, content mothers, song and dance, and most importantly happiness and love. Valka lost her concentration slightly as she felt her heart warm at his love. She saw her own face, slightly distorted and with too much light, in the alpha's dream. She was very bright in his dreams, and her eyes were always lively and wide, making her look young and hopeful again. Her staff was there, and she often had smudges around her head, like phantom horns or crests. She was an honorary dragon in the alpha's eyes. It never ceased to amaze her that this beautiful creature held them all so preciously in his heart. He was a gentle giant. Each and every member of their nest and family was carefully thought about and cherished in his thoughts, including her. He worried for her safety, he shared her joys and triumphs, he listened to her every worry and watched her every move, and dreamed and expressed his desire for her happiness. He never judged, never hated, always forgave and always loved unconditionally. Valka felt like a dotted daughter. He would do anything she asked if he thought it would make her and the nest happy. She admired him immensely. He balanced her happiness and safety with the happiness and safety of the nest family expertly, causing all the family to love him and grow unspoiled and prosperous under his care. He had no favorites, and he was not a tool or servant to order around. He was their protector, their teacher, their centerpiece and their outer shell. His rule was so successful that all the dragons under his care and command gave their lives and souls willingly to his bidding. He earned their respect and their love while giving his from the moment they joined his family. The family protects their own. The alpha protects them all. Valka smiled again when she saw the alpha dream of Hiccup. Hiccup was once again distorted in dreams. His eyes were too bright, his face too light, and there was an odd shadow around his back as if he carried invisible wings or a tail. Valka theorized that it was a visual representation of Hiccup's bond with Toothless, as Toothless also had a slight halo where Hiccup would normally cling, but she wasn't too interested in exploring why that was. It just was. It was proof of a bond so strong that it left a mark in the hearts and minds of those who witnessed it. The alpha thought of Hiccup tenderly. He was still a hatchling, and he understood that compared to a dragon he would always been a hatchling. Hatchlings were precious, no matter what their breed or relation. Valka was forever grateful to the mighty Ice Breather for helping her look after Hiccup when they were new to the nest. He ensured that all the dragons were kind and patient around her, tolerant of her strange ways and her strange hatchling. Without his approval, Valka was sure Hiccup would have died, and she would have had no will to live after that. It was thanks to him, and the caring dragons, that she had relearned how to survive. He taught her many things, language was most important. She saw the above sounds way they interacted, and it was the mighty Alpha who fully opened her mind and eyes enough to learn it, enough to speak it herself. He also taught her all kinds of secrets to keep her safe amongst other dragons. He taught her to not fear this new world, but to be fascinated by it. Valka embraced it willingly and gave back as much as she learned, trying to explain human ways to the Ice King. He often misunderstood or couldn't quite understand points or concepts, but accepted that humans had their own ways just as dragons did. He was always a willing listener. Hiccup, once again, having heard the Alpha's voice from his first year, had grown with his brain fine-tuned to his voice, like a violin. Dragons had shaped him very differently to a Viking, but Valka loved him for who he was and joined him in his world. Hiccup understood things easier than she did. Often he was her teacher where her experience didn't help. Hiccup had a deep respect and love for the Alpha. He once commented on his earliest memories being